Good evening. It is 7 p.m. Welcome to Upstart Magazine's Election Night 2013 live broadcast from here at La Trobe University's Melbourne campus. I am Liam Quinn, joined by Eric George. Eric, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Liam. Looking forward to what promises to be an exciting and important night in Australia's history. Of course, Labor has been widely tipped to suffer significant losses tonight, and we should start seeing results of those early and often, with key marginal seats in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria all in danger. Results have already started to trickle in, and they should continue to do so rapidly over the next few hours and should provide plenty of fuel for discussion over the night.
Did you get accosted this morning out at your local primary school, footy club, whatever it was out there in Clifton Hill where you call home?
No, it was pretty peaceful at 8:30 in the morning at Clifton Hill Primary. Sadly, no sausage sizzles at that point of the day, so I missed out there.
You're the only person I think who missed out on a sausage today.
Yeah, but it was still pretty full on. The last few metres before the gate was just a sea of hands with pamphlets thrust in my face.
Before we go any further, I think this is probably a pretty good time to let everyone know what is going to be coming up the rest of the night. So to avoid the pair of us, waffling on too much, we have managed to line up some great guests throughout the next few hours. Former Kevin Rudd, Senior Press Secretary Lachlan Harris chatted with us earlier. New Matilda's National Affairs correspondent Ben Eltham is also going to join us on the phone, which should be really good with that one later on. We spoke to La Trobe University Vice-Chancellor John Dewar earlier in the week. We'll be able to play that interview. Got some great podcasts as well. Daniel Flitton from The Age recorded one for us, which was good. Plus a heap of interviews with some other guests. We've got some small parties covered with Bridget Rollison's Party Crasher series. We'll be all over social media throughout the night with Kim Thompson manning our account. Hopefully chatting to some people as well, Eric, throughout the night, keeping our election songs and things like that coming in. But I'm most excited for this one. In a few minutes, ABC Insider's host and political extraordinaire Barry Cassidy will be joining us live from HQ.
Yeah, no, it should be good. The great man himself, and a fellow Collingwood fan for you.
We'll both have an eye half somewhere else tonight for a while, I think. But before we do get to Barry, Eric, presuming that we are a few hours away from Kevin Rudd being booted out of the lodge, where would you say that the ALP has lost this election so far?
Yeah, look, working on that assumption, which most people are at this point of the night already, with polls looking pretty dire for them, I think that, you really have to go back to square one for this. There's lots of symptoms that people point to, whether it's Rudd's personality or a factional infighting for Labor, or policy issues that they've had throughout the years. But I think this really boils down to just the fact that Labor has been disconnected from its identity. If I asked you, Liam, to sit down and define for me what the Labor Party could actually claim as their own tonight, I bet that you'd have a hard time doing so.
Yeah, it's very tough. I mean, you traditionally say they are the big party for the small guy sort of thing, the more compassionate party. But then, as we spoke about previously and has been written countless times, that their asylum seeker policy, which is really one of the big points of this campaign, is a move away from a traditional stance they've had. So besides losing that heartland vote, they've also ideologically shifted a little bit.
Yeah. I think you can see the fact that they've really lost a key identity and an understanding of what they are, and the fact that seats that you would consider traditionally very, very safe Labor seats in Western Sydney and Victoria, seats that no one would ever have considered to be in danger, are at risk of falling tonight. And I think it shows the fact that, that key voter base that Labor has relied upon for decades now is really disenchanted with the current state of the party. And, this has led to the Labor Party kind of jumping from one policy to the other to try and re-energise people. And whether it's backflips or people thinking that they can't trust the party, it's just ultimately resulted in, whether you want to call it disunity or people thinking that they just backflip all the time. They just don't think that they know who the Labor Party are, and they ultimately don't think that they can trust them.
And rightly or wrongly, it does seem like there is a bit of a throwing it together on the fly. I think especially the move, what was it, about a week ago now, to move the Navy up to Queensland was kind of seen as this is a way just to appease some voters up there, and it has that no clear big picture look about it.
Yeah, I think what some people are pointing to as the turning point in this campaign, and Paul Kelly wrote this in The Australian today, is the Northern Territory tax haven, as it's been labelled, and the decision apparently to do so was made on the plane trip from Victoria to the NT without consulting any of the key campaign HQ in Melbourne. And Rudd just made it with his key advisors, Bruce Hawker, his campaign advisor, and a few people on the plane. That really harkens back to bad Rudd in the kitchen cabinet of his first term. And it really just gives people bad memories of what's been going on, previously and why he got booted out. I think, that as you suggested, policy on the fly nature I would suggest that it comes down to just a lack of key strategy, but whatever you call it, it has really damaged Labor's credibility in this campaign.
Should we be surprised in a way that Kevin did seem to be operating as a bit of a lone wolf? I mean, that's always been his MO to some degree, hasn't it? He's been pretty centralised. He hasn't taken too many experts and things like that.
No, no. It has been his nature. He's been the outsider within the party, and obviously it's been written plenty that he rose to power just purely on the back of his polling rather than through any real support within the party. And once again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I feel like the fact that he was elected to lead this party not once but twice points to the fact that they just really seem fractured right now, and they don't seem to know who they are. If they, re-elected in desperation, somebody who they honestly feel like they knew they couldn't trust and wouldn't really back them and include the party, you have to really wonder how desperate the state of the party is and the political infighting that's going in there if they're turning to somebody that they know ultimately won't get them over the line.
Now, switching gears a little bit, one of the biggest moments Rudd has been able to get any traction lately, but almost all the campaign, was on Q&A on Monday when he had his, I think it went viral, the slavery Bible, the marriage equality sort of comments he had. Do you think enough has really been made, or have they failed to capitalise on that progressive advantage that he has over someone like Tony Abbott?
I think that that was a missed opportunity for Labor, and that was, in essence, that Q&A moment was the quintessential Kevin Rudd moment. It seemed instantly,
and that's his element.
Yeah,
with the people.
Absolutely, and it set Twitter alight. It got people excited or it hated, disliking him. But then, in the cold light of day, the next day, it seemed that maybe he'd stolen it from the West Wing, or maybe it wasn't as correct as he thought it was, and it just wasn't quite standing up to examination. So that in the 24 hours after that really struck me as very Rudd-esque. But you're right. I think that marriage equality, as a socially progressive issue, seemed like a very quintessential Labor policy, although perhaps not a very popular one in Western Sydney. It does seem like the kind of thing that a Gough Whitlam or a great Labor Prime Minister would get behind and would use to kind of energise the more progressive element of a voter base. And the fact that Kevin Rudd, he kind of kept dipped his toe in the water, but he never really dived in with it, just saying, we'll have a conscience vote within 100 days. It really was a bit of a letdown, I think.
Yeah, and I think on that, it is also a great chance, any of these hot button, for lack of a better term, issues, it is a great chance to show leadership, to say, look, I know this might not be exactly the most popular decision with the entire constituency, but it's the right thing to do and we can do it. And by not doing that, as you said, by kind of going halfway, it furthered that, Kevin's not really sure and he's a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and changing with the wind. I think that the coalition was presenting that view of him.
Yeah, I think that the other thing is, these small policies that we're talking about tonight, the NT tax zone, the moving a naval base from one state to another, those are not the kind of things that are going to win you an election campaign. It's the big issues that are going to energise people, and that's what Tony Abbott, the man who many people think will be the Prime Minister in a couple of hours, has been very good at, running an entire election around the strength of an economy and everything being underpinned by one key line. Not a lot of detail in there, but look, I think I think that lack of a grander scheme and that appearance to just be kind of chasing small detail policies, that didn't really interest people.
Well, we are going to talk about this more later, and obviously that's a targeted approach of the coalition, but we are joined now live from ABC's Election HQ, presumably a pretty busy HQ down there, by political analyst and host of Insiders, Barry Cassidy. Barry, thank you for joining us tonight.
No problems, guys.
Now, so counting's been underway for about an hour now. Have you any early predictions you'd like to make at this stage?
Well, the ABC, Anthony Green has called it probably the earliest that he has ever called an election. I think in the time that he's been covering them, I think at about 10 to 7, he said that given that the swings were consistently to the coalition and in fairly big numbers in almost every state, then he didn't need to wait for more reliable figures. He felt that there was no prospect of any other result but a coalition victory. And if you look at how it's going already on the screen, I think the coalition needs 76 seats. They've already got 69 at 7, and the Labor Party's on about 35. So the way that it's tracking, it does appear as if the coalition will win, keeping in mind they need 76 to form majority government. It looks as if they'll finish up with seats in the mid-90s.
Well, I had 750 in our sweeps here, so it seems like we've all missed the boat for that one. Barry, with it being so obvious, the next question has to become: do you think that it would have been better if they'd stuck with Julia Gillard?
I think it would have been better not only had they stuck with Julia Gillard, but that they hadn't undermined her and hadn't white-handed her. You see, the changing the leadership's one thing, but it was what occurred in the year or two before that, where any effort she made to build her stocks up and get into a winning position were immediately undermined by those who wanted Kevin Rudd in the job. So it wasn't just the change of leadership that you have to think about. It was what led up to that decision that they took in June. And it was incredibly destabilising. Like, you could argue that maybe Julia Gillard shouldn't have taken the leadership from Kevin Rudd all those years ago. Be that as it may, it's what occurred since then, so that disunity and destabilisation was the story of the Labor Party for 3 years or more. And you can't win in that situation. Disunity is genuinely the worst thing that can happen to a political party.
Hi, Barry. It's Eric here. Thanks for joining us.
No problem.
How has Tony Abbott been able to continue to campaign so hard on scrapping the carbon tax even after the Labor Party's dropped it?
Yeah, because he's also opposed to where the Labor Party is now. He doesn't want an ETS at all. He doesn't want any semblance of what the Labor Party put in place. So he was able to campaign for that. He wants that to go altogether, so that Australia is not part of any international trading system, and rely directly on direct action. Look, it was a really weird campaign in that sense, because you had Labor abandoning some of their well-held principles to try and take those issues out of the campaign, that is, asylum seekers and carbon tax, to the point where you didn't know what Labor stood for anymore. And then on the other hand, you had the Liberals give in on education reform, and they gave in on the NDIS because the Liberal states were signing up. And so they took those issues out of the campaign. And what were you left with? Sort of presidential contest, I guess. And Kevin Rudd always thought he would win that, and particularly in Queensland, but as it turned out, he didn't.
Do you think that, the fact that the public was still buying into this scrap the tax mantra and stop the boats, even when the Labor Party were leaving a carbon tax and had shown an ability to stop the boats, demonstrated the fact that the public had stopped listening to the Labor Party before this campaign had even begun?
Yeah, I think they'd made up their mind a long time ago. I guess that's one argument in favour of a leadership change. When you're in that situation, you might as well try something. But I just think they were in a better position with Julia Gillard being able to at least contest on some genuine Labor Party values. And the fact that she'd already had some achievements on the board. She had the NDIS, and she had education reform, and she had the NBN. She had the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. She had something that she could take out there into the marketplace. You look back over Kevin Rudd's career, the first 3 years and then the last 70 days, and he's got nothing. There's not a single policy achievement that he was able to point to. He was able to talk about getting Australia through the global financial crisis, but that's not a policy position as such. He was able to talk about the apologies to the Aborigines, but that's gesture. That's a gesture, not a policy. So there wasn't a single big policy achievement that he was able to point to.
Barry, do you also think that they perhaps focused on the wrong issues in some way by constantly trying to hark on about costings when it showed that wasn't really having too much of an impact in the negative campaign they adopted around Tony Abbott?
Yeah, I think they started badly by going on about the GST. Nobody wore that. Nobody bought it. And yet they spent a lot of time on that when they should have been talking about the more positive elements. And then, of course, with the costings, I think they got that all wrong anyway. They seemed to suggest that the numbers were not going to add up. That was never the issue. They needed to talk about the cuts when they finally came. But then, good politics on the coalition's part when the cuts came. They didn't impact on ordinary people. They didn't cut into health and education. And then what they did do was take $4.5 billion from foreign aid, and that issue in itself deserved better than a 24-hour debate. But that's not the kind of thing that changes votes.
Do you think that, looking at Tony Abbott as a prime ministerial candidate, how much do you think he's benefited from the lack of scrutiny he's received thanks to the constant mishaps that Labor's run out over this campaign?
Yeah, look, Tony Abbott avoided scrutiny for a very long time, and then when he finally exposed himself to that sort of scrutiny, he had no difficulty dealing with it. He had a very good campaign. He didn't blow any of the interviews along the way. But avoiding it, sure. But you'd have to say the Labor Party has to take a lot of the responsibility for that, because they made themselves a story over the last 3 years through their constant infighting.
You mentioned, obviously, Abbott's performance. Is it a testament to how much he's changed in the last few years that he is a pretty polished, almost non-offensive in terms of a media performer now?
Yeah, it's funny about expectations, isn't it? Because I heard Andrew Robb, one of his colleagues on television this morning, saying he shocked everybody through his discipline. So what does that imply? That they all expected that at some point there'd be a breakdown in discipline. It didn't happen. I remember him coming on Insiders when he first became leader, and he sat opposite me in the studio, and I asked him the question. I said, "Is there anything you fear about leadership?" And he said, "Yes, interviews like this." That was kind of, he was as nervous as a kitten. And last Sunday, I sat opposite him, and it was a different person altogether. He was a lot more accomplished and confident, and didn't seem to fear the process at all. And when you look back over his performance through the campaign, I think he just grew in stature, but in confidence as well.
But perhaps looking at the opposition's performance more broadly in this campaign, you don't think that the 24 hours on Thursday when they released the costings and then they had the whole policy backflip on the internet filter, you don't think that demonstrates that perhaps a little bit more media scrutiny could have dented their confidence a bit going into this election?
Yes, it does. But then again, I think the media gave them a hard time for delaying their costings. It was constantly referred to. I don't think anybody who was following the election would have missed the fact that they were playing this trick on the electorate, just as Kevin Rudd played the same trick in 2007. The shame is, though, they got away with it. And as a result of that, when you consider now that 3 million people cast either postal votes or pre-poll votes, so days out from the election when you've got millions of people already voting, that will only encourage these political parties to hide the truth until the last minute. So I just don't expect any reform on that front, and that's a pity.
Now, seeing it's probably one of the last times we'll get to refer to him as this, Barry, do you think this has been one of the most successful opposition leaders in Tony Abbott?
Absolutely. I always argued that you couldn't say that because he'd never won an election, and you can't be a successful opposition leader unless you get the ultimate prize. Now he's got the ultimate prize, so I think you're able to say it. I think the most successful opposition leader before Tony Abbott was Gough Whitlam, for this reason that he not only hung in there for years and then eventually won the election, but he reformed the Labor Party to get there. It wasn't just a question of picking up the party as Bob Hawke did and then getting elected. Gough Whitlam had reformed the party to put it into a shape that people would accept, and he did that. He did all the hard work in opposition. With Tony Abbott, what he had to do was put together a certain discipline within the Liberal Party, and then just keep the pressure on the Labor Party, and he did that for the best part of 5 years. And tonight he's reaping the dividend. Now,
switching gears a little bit, Barry, if it has been called pretty early, you should be able to have some free time from 7:50 to 10:20. Are you set up to make sure you're keeping an eye on the football tonight?
We've got a bank of televisions here, so I can keep an eye on several things at once. I can chew gum and walk at the same time.
Fantastic. And we'll look forward to speaking to you a bit later on this evening as well. And hopefully your Collingwood starts pretty well before we talk to you at 9 o'clock.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, Barry. So that was Barry Cassidy joining us from ABC headquarters there. Eric, some interesting things to say. I think it was interesting to see he firstly really committed to Tony Abbott being one of the most successful opposition leaders.
Yeah, it's deserved. Like you said, perhaps he had benefited. You know, people always were criticising Tony Abbott for perhaps avoiding the tough media interviews. He was never going on Fane on 774. He was never going on Q&A or Late Line or 7:30. But look, it's been a very successful campaign for him.
Okay, but we can discuss that a bit more later. At the moment, we're just going to quickly throw to a break for a moment. Now we're back. We're joined by our esteemed executive producer for the night, Eric, who is steering us through the ropes or gates or whatever we're going to call them. Talia McPherson. Talia, thanks for being with us briefly.
It's good to be here, guys.
So you've got some quick stats and updates for us from what's been going on today.
Yes, so today more than 14 million people were registered to vote, which is an increase of more than 500,000 people compared to the last election in 2010. We also saw a few new election records today. More than 1,700 candidates contested federal seats, and there were double the number of micro-parties compared to the last election. Another big thing with this election was a rise in people casting their votes before polling day. So what do you guys think the candidates have had to adapt to that?
There's a few things you've got in there that I think will be really important tonight. The micro parties is one that a lot of people have been focusing on. All of us who went to vote today and had to deal with the polling, the ballots that were wider than the booths themselves can attest to how many people were standing. And that's just going to make the Senate such a nightmare to try and negotiate. But yeah, the fact that so many people voted so early this election, an unprecedented number, I think is an interesting thing to consider as a trend going forwards, because the advertising blitz in the last days is not as effective as it used to be, because it's reaching less available voters.
Especially with a shorter campaign like this one, when you think if you're voting, you're probably voting about a week ago. You're not going to be sending it out on Wednesday or Thursday or something like that. So all of a sudden, a 5-week campaign for some people becomes 3.5, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So it's much shorter than it was.
Yeah. I think that we'll be getting to this in a bit with social media and the way that election is being covered and how much it's changed. And I think this campaign shows that there's a lot of lessons that need to be learned by both parties for how they attack things in 3 years' time. With you look even then with the amount of increase in voters, some of that has to be new voters as well as immigrants. So if Labor's losing an election with so many young voters joining on, that's not a good thing for them, because that would traditionally be a key part of their voter base. But I think there have been a lot of lessons that will be learnt tonight and carried forward in 3 years.
Now, we'll obviously discuss a lot of those lessons later, but Talia, what are some of the other things we've got coming up over the next couple of hours so me and Eric can plan ahead a little bit?
Yeah, so throughout our program tonight, we've had a number of people tweeting in with songs that sum up the election campaign so far for them, and we want more. Do you guys have a song in mind?
Eric, you can kick us off with this one.
I think I'll go with The Animals. Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. I think Tony Abbott has spent much of the last 4 years, considering he's just a poor boy whose intentions are good.
Interesting. I think to start off with, I might go with Downbound Train by Bruce Springsteen, because if you're a Labor voter, you're just on a downbound train at the moment.
Well, speaking of, Wayne Swan, big Springsteen fan, his seat's in danger tonight.
Drowning his sorrows to Born to Run somewhere this evening.
How about you, Talia?
Yeah, well, I think with Tony Abbott's latest gaffes about sex appeal, I think he thinks that he's bringing sexy back, so I'm going to go with that song.
It's always good to get JT in the broadcast somehow.
Oh, those budgie smugglers, they do it. They do things.
Yeah, so for all our listeners, if you want to let us know your election song, join in the conversation on Twitter using #upstart. And still to come on Upstart's election tonight, on our election coverage tonight, we'll be talking with Ben Eltham, and Bridget Rolston's Party Crashers segment is still to come, and so much more.
We're kind of held by time a little bit. We're not sure how many hours we'll be on for, but we've got another throw to go to now. Sorry.
You're tuned to upstart.net.au. This is Australia Decides, our coverage of the 2013 federal election. We're broadcasting live from the studios at La Trobe University. Tell us your thoughts by tweeting us at Upstart Magazine or by using the Upstart hashtag.
Welcome back to Upstart Magazine's live coverage of Election Night 2013. It is 7:28. I am Liam Quinn, joined by Eric George, and also Adria DeFazio is with us at the moment to help us out with our next interview. Adria, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So now we're joined by New Matilda's national correspondent, Ben Eltham. Ben is as we said, national correspondent. He's also a fellow at the Centre for Policy Development. He recently completed his PhD in public policy at the University of Western Sydney. Sorry, a bit of a mouthful there. And after that lengthy introduction, he joins us on the phone now. Ben, thanks for being with us.
Hey guys, how are you?
So one of the things you recently wrote about was how direct action, the policy, can't really work, which is something Tony Abbott somewhat admitted to recently. With that in mind, has the real action on climate change been somewhat overlooked this election campaign?
Well, I mean, you'd have to say that action on climate change is going to go into reverse now that it's pretty obvious we're going to have a coalition victory. So, Labor's handled the politics of carbon pretty poorly over the last 3 years, and as a result, Tony Abbott's riding to victory on the coattails of the unpopular carbon tax.
Where do you find the Greens Party? I think they're particularly interesting in the past Parliament, and particularly coming into the next one. Where do you think they'll stand when all the numbers are tallied?
It's too early to call because we don't have any numbers in for the seat of Melbourne, so we don't know how Adam Bandt is going. On a national level, the Greens are polling at about 8.5%, so that is a swing away from the Greens of about 2.5% from their historic highs of 2010.
Do you think that that's because there's public disappointment in their policy achievements?
I think it's hard to put it down to any one thing. I mean, in fact, in terms of policy achievements, the Greens have racked up a lot of achievements in minority government with Julia Gillard. So I think it's more to do with the fact that a lot of voters are not particularly pleased with some of the Greens' politics, some of their agendas. And I also think there's been a swing to the right in general across the entire electorate. And that's affected the Greens, obviously, as the leftmost party on the spectrum.
Okay. Do you think that people are voting Green merely as an option to get Tony Abbott out and keep the coalition out of power, which is looking increasingly unlikely? But do you think that that might be the main factor why people are voting Green this election?
No, I think the Greens vote is mostly base. Most people who vote Greens are, I think, strong Green voters. They're not swinging voters. In the recent past, the Greens have been able to pick up a lot of disaffected Labor voters from the left wing of Labor. I'm still seeing that happening in a lot of seats, for example, in inner city Melbourne. But it does seem that Labor's stabilised that kind of vote in some of those key seats, like Graindler, for example. Anthony Albanese has got a swing towards him and away from the Greens.
Is 2016 their next shot, do you think, at gaining some seats, whether it be in the Senate or the House of Representatives?
Yes, by definition, 2016 is their next shot, unless we have a double dissolution election between then and now. I mean, look, the Greens have a long-term future in the lower house, in my opinion. And the reason is that over time I expect a number of seats in inner city Melbourne and perhaps in inner city Sydney to become safe Green seats. So I expect in the future, perhaps by 2019, that the Greens will have 3 or 4 seats in the lower house.
Looking at the coalition, why do you think that they released their costings so late in the game?
Because they could. Really, it was a tactical manoeuvre to distract attention from some potentially unpopular spending cuts. They handled it very well, and they were able to really slide through the election campaign with minimal scrutiny on their policy agenda.
Hey Ben, it's Eric George. Thanks for joining us. Do you think that, harking back to what you were talking about before, about the fact that, climate change policy really is going into reverse here, do you think some of the blame for that has to be apportioned to Rudd when he was leading Labor in his first term for losing momentum on the public goodwill that was behind climate change policy?
Yeah, I do actually. I think Kevin Rudd had an opportunity in late 2009 to go to a double dissolution electorate on the back of 2 votes against his CPRS. I think that if he'd done that, he would have won that double dissolution election. He probably would have killed off Tony Abbott's leadership then and there, and he would have established a mandate for action on climate change and carbon emissions, really for the foreseeable future. Now, he squibbed that opportunity. He let Tony Abbott establish a very strong fear campaign against the carbon tax, and the rest, as we know, is history.
Now, Ben, other than climate change, what would you say would be one of the other major issues for the 44th Parliament once they sit?
I think fiscal policy will be a key issue. So what the government, the incoming government, plans to do about the state of the budget, whether they raise taxes or cut spending, or simply let the budgets continue to stay in deficit for several years. The Coalition has made a lot of how we're in a budget emergency. They've made some very strong statements throughout Labor's government about what a poor economic manager Labor has been. And so there will be pressure on an incoming Abbott government to move the budget back to surplus more quickly.
Now, Ben, what's the plan for the rest of the night? Are you guys all just kind of waiting around for a result like the rest of us, or...?
I'm live blogging for New Matilda right now, so I'm updating the New Matilda website. I'm also on Twitter, and I'm about to head over to 3RRR and do some commentary for those guys.
Oh, thanks for taking the time out to join us.
My pleasure.
So that was Ben Eltham, National Affairs Correspondent for New Matilda, joining us there on the phone. That was so we're back from that quick break. We're joined now by Kathleen O'Connor, who has some news updates for us. Kathleen, any seats starting to be called yet?
So we're currently unsure about it at the moment, but we do have a swing in the Lindsay seat to the Liberals at 50.3%, at 3.8% counted. It's a problem for the Liberals with the last two elections with late selections. The ABC still predicts a coalition victory, with the most marginal seat in the country so far being Corongamite in Victoria. In the chambers there has been an 8.4% of seats counted, where Labor has won 41 seats and the coalition at 68 seats. The ABC, as predicted, likely seats to be Labor at 37 and the coalition at 74. And there are a lot of seats very, very close at the moment, with the primary vote for the Labor government is 32.9%, which is the worst primary vote since the 30s.
Yeah, there is clearly scope for a particularly historical result tonight. You know, a lot of people are projecting upwards of 20 seats to be lost from Labor tonight, which I think would place it in the top 5 losses in electoral history.
It's a proverbial landslide, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's getting ugly.
Yeah. You mentioned Lindsay before. What was the figure there? Did you say that was swinging back towards Labor?
They were swinging to the Liberals by 50.3%. Yep.
Yeah. So that's an interesting seat there, because Lindsay is actually the longest running bellwether seat of any seat in Australia. It's always been won by the governing party since it's come into power. So, you know, the Senator Bradbury, the climate change minister, is there, and he won by the thinnest of margins in 2010. He's in danger there.
And it was amazing that they're likely going to win is obviously Fiona Scott, who had her famed comment earlier in the week that there's so much traffic on the M4 in Sydney because of asylum seekers, which turned out to be hideously false.
Yeah, well, and also she was the so-called sex appeal candidate. Yeah. So, well, we could be seeing her in power in time. And look, that would still hold true for Lindsay, because if that's swinging to the Liberal Party, that is another governing party with a seat in Lindsay.
Kathleen, any other final quick updates before we wait on for some more news later on this evening?
Again, guys, it's only 13.9% counted, so we've still got a long ride ahead.
Still got a bit of time to go.
Yep.
Eric, on that, we've been talking for about 40 minutes or so now, so I think people might want to break. With that in mind, I think it's a perfect chance to feature our first podcast of the night. Professor Nick Bisley here at La Trobe has been recording a series of podcasts he called Australia Decides. The first was kind of general election chit-chatter back in the first week it was called, so we'll quickly throw to that one now. We'll be able to hear some of the best bits.
It's International Vulture Awareness Day. Do you think they took that into account at all?
I think Rudd would have put that through the numbers machine and considered that on balance, the preferences probably weren't going to be too badly shifted by concern about vultures or other avian critters.
Tony Abbott said that he won't lead a minority government. Is that a risky promise to make? And why does he make a promise like that in the first place?
I mean, I think it's a sort of, it's not a massive Abbott gaffe of the kind all of us are waiting to occur, because he's been holding up for 3 years. It's a bit like waiting for the volcano to erupt. But I think this was an instinct that he came out with, and that also feeds into the internal narrative that Abbott's got about being a strong and decisive leader, Howard 2.0. And I think that's I'm never going to negotiate with the crossbenchers. Is he going to have to make good on this? That'll be interesting to watch. I tend to think, if you look at how things play out, even if we get a really close electoral outcome, the odds are still in the favour of coalition stitching together a fairly comfortable majority, particularly given that the two New South Wales independents are leaving rather than get voted out. They're quietly packing their bags themselves, and they're almost a lay-down misere to be LNP pickups. So I think the prospect of him having to stitch four separate independents together to make a coalition is actually quite small. So it is risky because I think when faced with the opportunity of forming government, as he is reputed to have said during 2010, I'd sell my ass to form government, he'd do it again if he gets the opportunity. But I think that's actually a relatively low probability outcome.
Yep, I agree.
Yep.
Chances of it actually happening are pretty low.
Avatar's being on sale for government, low probability event.
The numbers that they said it's going to cost them, they're funneling $632 million over 4 years into Papua New Guinea and an additional $420 million into aid. So that's safely over $1 billion there. Is that a good way to put money into dealing with such a problem?
No.
No?
It's crazy. It's unbelievably bad value for money. It's it's breathtakingly expensive and crazy in any rational cost-benefit analysis of these things. The way the asylum seeker issue has played out in the Australian political landscape is peculiar. It's got this funny status where the normal rules don't apply. So the normal financial rules don't apply, the normal political rules. The numbers of people we're talking about are, by any reasonable sense, fairly small, and yet it has a powerful pull on the popular imagination, particularly amongst electors in marginal seats. So the normal rule book goes out the window.
Who should we believe when it comes to crunching the numbers?
There's a tried and true method that governments normally use. If the opposition wins, where you can get into office and then say, turns out that the budget's in a worse state than we realised, we're now going to have to bring in a whole lot of deep cuts to get things back into balance. So my guess is it's quite likely that would happen should the opposition win.
I take a slightly different view, which is this is macroeconomic modelling, and macroeconomic modelling is the closest thing in economics to voodoo. It's guesswork. It's absolute guesswork at the best of times. And essentially, it's guesswork predicated on a set of big number of inputs that are themselves guesses. And they've got a series of models that are matched up against time series, and they think how it's going to work. So it's always guesswork at the best of time. The problem is where the global economy is at today, and the Australian economy itself, effectively in a cycle, it doesn't match any of the time series that they build these things on. Everywhere in the world, macroeconomic modelling on what you're sort of likely to get in terms of revenue, in terms of where GDP is going to go, is all over the place. So don't believe anyone when they tell you anything about what the economy is doing.
The Daily Telegraph said this: finally, you now have the chance to kick this mob out.
For my last question, is the Daily Telegraph just a Liberal pamphlet?
Has been for years.
Who's this election against? Is it Rudd v Abbott or is it Rudd v Murdoch?
I think the Murdoch press generally has been anti-ALP for a long, long period of time. And there's no mystery here. Why Murdoch wants to get rid of the ALP is a slightly separate issue, why the Murdoch press hates them so much. But what I think is crazy is the ALP fixating on this and going on and on about Tony Abbott's a stooge of Rupert Murdoch and this sort of stuff. This is just, who cares? A, firstly, we know this. B, the electoral research on this stuff is quite interesting. Newspaper headlines do not shift voter preferences. Newspaper headlines follow voter preferences. And there's years and years of research, mostly in Britain on this, where they have a much more volatile press than we do, or a much more vivid press, shall we say. I don't think the ALP is making a really big tactical error by paint the coalition as the stooges of Murdoch and the puppets at the strings of, the octogenarian, thrice married media baron. It has almost no benefit for them to do it and gets them off the message that they need to be saying, which is, we're good on the economy and the like. So why Murdoch hates the ALP so much, I'm not sure. The general thinking with Murdoch is he's got a fairly good kind of electoral radar who works out who's going to win and butters them up. And so, if anything, I think that's probably what's going on. I mean, there is some interesting speculation about what's going to happen after the election, come what may, even if Rudd wins. Because I think if Rudd wins, the ALP has barely papered over the divisions they've got. Rudd is, he won a reasonable majority in caucus, but there's still a fairly large chunk of the caucus that hate his guts. And if they're in with a viable majority, that's not going to keep happy for too long. The best case scenario you can think on the numbers is that they'll have maybe a 6-seat majority, maybe. They're going to be lucky to form government even if all the cards go their way. There are these big divisions within the party that aren't going to be papered over. So we could get more destabilisation, even though Rudd's tried to preempt that with this lockdown. If they lose, Does Rudd quietly take his bat and ball and go to Geneva or wherever he's dreaming of going? No. He's the electoral terminator. This is a guy who will keep going until he gets what he wants, or kills you, or both. The idea that if they push him out the door, if they lose and they push him out the door, that Rudd will just leave. Rudd thinks he's the greatest Prime Minister the country's ever seen. He doesn't let facts get in the way of that self-image. So any ALP leader is going to have to firstly murder Rudd or convince him to leave. He is a fratricidal guy who's going to continue to do this for so long as he's in the party. The most likely event is a smallish win by either side, which means we're back in the same place in 3 years. So if you're an aspirant leader thinking, I'm always not too far away from being Prime Minister, I'm ever not too far away from my chance. In some respects, it's a function of the 3-year electoral cycle. If you're Rudd, if you're like the UK and you've got a 5-year term and you miss out, you really got to bide your time for a long while before you're back in with a chance. Whereas with us, you're never more than 18 months away from hope. And given the way the electorate is breaking at the moment, it's a recipe for this kind of volatility within the party. And the one thing we haven't talked about, though, is the way in which the Libs themselves are going to face these divisions, because there are big divisions on policy terms within the Liberal Party. They've papered over them very well and have been very disciplined in their approach so far. But, you think about the big 3 issues, whether it's, broadly speaking, social policy, whether it's gay marriage or what have you, climate change and education policy, they're really divided, really seriously divided. And if they get into government, they're going to have these big fights as well.
You mentioned volatility in the environment and the divisiveness in the Liberal Party. How safe is Abbott's leadership, no matter which way the election goes?
I think if they lose, he's toast.
The man behind the curtain looks rather convincing.
Which one?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Ah, Turnbull, wow. Turnbull's convincing. There's a great tweet that when Rudd got back in from some Lib staff, not staffer, but a Liberal figure, I can't recall who it was, he said, if they can have their most popular leader, why can't we have ours? The problem is the Liberal Party room hate him with a passion. They can't stand Turnbull. So you've got a funny mirror in many respects of the Rudd situation. I think if he loses, he'll walk. If he wins, that's the really interesting thing. If he wins by a bit, will they topple him? Nicholas knows the Liberal Party history much better than I do, but my guess is the Liberal Party are much more instrumental and are much more disciplined historically. They tend to understand the basic rule of Westminster politics, which is divided parties lose, and the electorate doesn't like them. So I think if he wins, he's probably got a term, at least term and a half. He isn't electorally popular and has significant weaknesses, so he's in no means cast in stone in that position.
The other issue, I guess, for Abbott is if some of it will probably depend on the margin. If they only sort of scrape into office, having been ahead for a long period of time in the polls, that would probably weaken his position a little bit as well. I guess we'll know shortly.
So that was La Trobe University politics professor Nick Bisley with the first of his Australia Decides podcast. Eric, we're going to hear a few more of those throughout the night, but before we go on, we've got some news coming in. Some high-profile faces in pretty steady seats getting theirs. Ed Husick, Tony Burke, Anthony Albanese all look set to hold theirs. Turnbull appears to have been re-elected out in Griffith. The ABC is apparently reporting that Turnbull in Wentworth. The ABC is reporting that Kevin Rudd is going to hold Griffith, where Sky is still saying it's too close to call from what we're being told. And an interesting one, Barnaby Joyce, who was parachuted into New England in somewhat, has won that seat with the largest margin out of anyone in the lower house, we're hearing at the moment. So that's... The other ones are pretty expected, but that Barnaby news is pretty big.
Yeah, it is big. I mean, it was. People did seem to think that that it was a fait accompli once Tony Windsor stepped down. It was looking for a long time like Barnaby could lose if Windsor stood in New England. But as soon as Windsor stood aside, it was really Barnaby's seat to take, and he's done that. The re-election of Labor ministers in the Western Sydney is a significant one, because these were people who, if we were seeing a violent swing against Labor in New South Wales, that's the people that we could see dropping. So the fact that they're staying on, the fact that they've managed to hold those seats mean that it's not as bad as it may have looked for Labor in Western Sydney.
So also some news coming in as well. Apparently it's looking good for Adam Bandt in the seat of Melbourne, which it kind of goes against what I've heard a bit today. I heard that he was in a bit of trouble, but apparently it's not too bad for him now.
Well, this is going to go down to a knife edge. Even if it's looking good, this is going to be, I think, a seat that won't be called soon.
As Kathleen was saying earlier, we're still only around about the 20% mark.
I mean, the Australian today was suggesting that Bandt would need about 40% of the primary vote to win this seat, which they were polling very high 30s. So they think they're going to get there, but it's going to be a very close run thing, because the Liberals have preferenced Labor ahead of the Greens in the seat, an unprecedented move in the lower house. And that's going to make life difficult for him, which is why he requires such a high level of the primary vote.
Especially considering last time he actually lost the primary from memory, but won it on preferences.
I think he might have just marginally had...
Might have shaded it.
Yeah.
It was very close either way, I can't remember how. But now, Eric, one of the biggest talking points we have to move on to this campaign has been the media's impact, which really started, as Nick Bisley mentioned briefly in the podcast there, with the Daily Telegraph's now infamous "kick this mob out" front page. Now, I mean, it's kind of beyond doubt that the tabloid media has had an impact on this campaign. But do you think that this is a case of Murdoch being out to get Labor, as it were, or is it just him really making decisions for business?
I've been reading a fair bit about this recently because it is one of the more interesting, narratives that we've seen in this campaign. And I'm starting to reach the conclusion that I think it could be a bit of both, because there are these two narratives. There is the personal interests of Rupert Murdoch because of the NBN and the impacts that it'll have on Foxtel. Now, Rupert Murdoch's most profitable business within Australia, and high-speed internet will allegedly hurt the profits of that. So he's campaigning in favour of a party that would scrap the NBN. But there's also the other element where, Murdoch has been a deeply conservative member of a high-profile member of the public for some time, and someone who's also been quite anti-establishment. He enjoys being powerful and unseating people. And ultimately, I think whether it's one or the other, we might not know, but we can say that one validates the other. It gives him an excuse to pursue the other aim if he believes in both. So, yeah, I think that the truth lies somewhere in between.
Now, you mentioned the NBN and obviously pay TV. The biggest thing that people have been saying, from what I've been reading, the concerns with that isn't torrenting shows and stuff like that. It's the live sport market, and obviously talk that you see now the AFL's deal and the NRL's deal has an internet package included into it, that it could get to a point where rather than paying Channel 7 paying all their money for the broadcast or however it works, and Foxtel paying for it and things like that, then you could just do it online with the NBN being so good. Well, I mean, the NBN probably won't be a policy now, but with the internet in that case being so good that you could just stream it live from AFL.com or NRL.com or whatever it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget the power of iView, something that's starting to cost the ABC an arm and a leg to maintain because it's extremely popular. That online streaming TV for free is certain to hurt the prospects of Foxtel, which also with its Go services is using a lot of online streaming itself behind a paywall. So yeah, I think that it's a combination of the two. But either way, you have to understand that previous Labor prime ministers have understood that whether you like Rupert Murdoch or not, he's an extremely powerful person and he's someone that you have to keep happy. So when Keating was in power, he managed to deregulate the newspaper market and allowed Murdoch to maintain or to increase his control of newspapers in Australia. And although a lot of what Keating did may not have been as traditionally Murdoch idealistics, he did manage to keep him on side to a certain extent by giving him newspapers. And I'm not sure that Labor in these last two terms have done a very good job of keeping Murdoch on side.
Now, also just a few other bits of news coming in before we continue talking about this. Jason Clare holds his safe Labor seat. We're also hearing a few others have held. Gabe Rootman has been elected again as well out there. John Cobb retains a safe Liberal seat. Yeah, so pretty expected with most of those information. Do you think that this campaign with the media has kind of given some more credence to the Finkelstein report, where it was saying that that really there's not enough accountability and transparency, and that this perhaps makes you look at it again and say, well, if there is a case where a media organisation is picking sides, as News Limited has done really this entire campaign, that report now has a bit of extra strength or weight behind it?
Yeah, it depends who you ask, because when this report came out, academics and media commentators outside of the working sphere seemed to be very supportive of it. They were thinking, this is finally somebody's trying to, reduce the concentration of media ownership in Australia and try to regulate what people can say. Of course, as we know, almost all the editors in Australia went ballistic about it and said that this is an attack on free speech in Australia, and my government should not be interfering with the press. The Fifth Estate needs to be free and needs to be able to really keep the government on track and keep them accountable. So I think that what we've seen certainly doesn't help the case for those who think that the media is responsible enough on its own without regulation to conduct a balanced campaign, because it hasn't been pretty, what we've seen on the front page of the tabloids just in the last 5 weeks.
Now, do you think that perhaps goes to, it's something we spoke about a little bit in preparation for this, the need to keep the media on side and be friendly with the press gallery and that sort of thing, which Rudd's notoriously prickly attitude at times hasn't made him the darling of the press gallery. Obviously, it helped him get back in on a kind of wave of media. But do you think that shows that the benefits of perhaps keeping people happy? I mean, like the way that Malcolm Turnbull goes on Q&A pretty often and is happy to sit there and be a media face, that is more important now than ever?
Yeah, look, it's difficult to point to one specific thing and say, look, this is what pissed the media off and this is why they never really helped you in your campaign, because Kevin Rudd hasn't gotten much of a leg up in the last couple of months. But you speak to media personalities and they say, well, look, the Labor Party under Rudd compared to Gillard was actually more helpful to us. They did, brief us before things and they kept us in the loop and they gave us more stories. And of course, when Kevin Rudd was not the leader, he was giving the media plenty to write about because his volatile leader campaign against the leader really, helped them sell a lot of copies.
Plenty of newspapers sold from the backbench.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what I think you can say is his habit of cancelling presses on late notice or rescheduling things without telling anybody.
Or just being generally late as well, which is a very good thing.
He's infamously late, always pushing back live crosses and the like. That can't help. If you're a journalist and you're thinking, well, which way do I go on this? Or even if it's just subconscious, those little things have to add up at some level. So even if you can't say, well, look, Kevin Rudd cut his own throat with the way he's dealt with the media over the last 5 years, it hasn't helped.
Now, obviously, this is this is a topic pretty close to your heart, but his fallout with Chris Mitchell has been highlighted as a bit of a key point as well.
Yeah, I think this is something that we're going to look back on in a few years' time and think was one of the key storylines during this period of Labor leadership. I think that you look at Chris Mitchell, someone who was once close friends of Rudd, even before he was in federal parliament when he was just an assistant to a premier, and Chris Mitchell was just starting to try out and climb the rungs at News. They were very close. Chris Mitchell then went on to marry a woman who wrote a very influential book about Rudd. Kevin Rudd is the godfather to one of Chris Mitchell's sons, and they were tight. Mitchell then was obviously very influential in pushing for the Australian to endorse Rudd in 2007, something that's pretty shocking when you look back on it and what happened since. The fact that a Murdoch broadsheet went out and said, it's time for Labor to come in.
Especially when you think how it appealed to that traditional sort of conservative market in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going out and saying this is a guy who wants to, get on board with Kyoto, to apologise to the stolen generation and all that kind of stuff. Those aren't things you think would be normally sold to an Australian readership, but he did it anyway. And then after that, it all went horribly south for the two of them. The Australian was the first newspaper to really get on board the attack Rudd bandwagon. They were the first media outlet, in print at least, to really go hard on him and initiate this narrative of Rudd as a very chaotic Prime Minister and someone who wasn't really getting anything done and was frustrating his cabinet.
Which ultimately stripped away all that goodwill that he had off the back of 2007 when he was the bumper sticker and the T-shirt and all those popular, transformative character in some ways in Australian politics. And then you think that 3 years later it was all gone. It was a very quick turnaround.
Yeah, it was shocking. I mean, the biggest flame out in Australian political history went from the most popular Prime Minister ever to the first-term Prime Minister to be axed by his own party. That's pretty nuts. And you think about the relationship with the two of them. They obviously were always going to butt heads. You've got the Prime Minister and the editor of a newspaper that was going to have to sell copy against them. And I think the difference between the two of them might boil down to the fact that Kevin Rudd seems to be a very personality-driven person, and Chris Mitchell, although allegedly when he sinks his teeth into somebody doesn't let go, he still, from what I've read, is able to see the difference between the man and the issue. And we was running against Kevin Rudd, the man, at the issue, and Kevin Rudd thought he was just being attacked personally and never really let it go. And I think that difference might have really spelt the end for the two of them. You think the fact that later on, Mitchell apparently was trying to help Rudd realise how damaging the mining tax was going to be and saying, look, you really need to get off this issue, otherwise you're going to get booted. And at that point, Kevin Rudd was so pissed off at the guy, he wasn't even listening and wasn't able to see the political advantage of maybe keeping some friends in Parliament. And I think, we were talking before about Kevin Rudd, the outsider in the Labor Party. And I think his, focus on personality, everything, may have really hurt one of the more important relationships in his political career as well.
Now, before we go on, a few extra bits of news coming in. Liberal Sarah Henderson, is apparently on track to romp to victory in Corangamite, which is the most marginal seat in the country, which is a pretty interesting bit of news. Hopefully we've got that one right with our crack researchers out the back. Also, Andrew Wilkie has been re-elected after his upset in 2010. Anna Burke retained in Chisholm. And ABC is reporting a Clive Palmer won seat that was is Flinders, that used to be Greg Hunt's seat.
Yeah,
if I'm reading that correctly.
Well, we'll have to wait. The Clive Palmer thing is going to be fascinating to see exactly, what they come out of this election with. He's polled extraordinarily well in Queensland, which is fascinating.
Also, that last little bit we've got in is apparently Sky is saying that there is a 17.7 percentage point swing against Bob Katter in Kennedy, which is pretty big because Katter's, he's the larger than life Katter. You think he'd be pretty sure. He's got his own party. I mean, he can't have his own party if he's not in Parliament, can he?
Yeah, that's very surprising. And we knew this was going to happen. Although we've had very consistent polling for some time, we also knew that there were always going to be surprises. There's going to be some upsets, a la John Howard a couple of years ago getting booted out. I'm still interested to see what happens in Indy in northern Victoria, where Sophie Mirabella has just had a horrible campaign.
It hasn't been great for Sophie, which we all here feel very upset about.
Well, look, whatever you think about her, it's been remarkable how, an independent candidate with very little funding has really been able to dismantle her
and
confidence.
Especially that pamphlet that went out during the week. That was in it. It just seems like a desperate kind of clutching at straws move. And it was
I saw on Twitter today that the polling booths in the seat had been plastered with anti-independent propaganda. You just got to wonder who comes up with these ideas, because Sophie Mirabella, once again, whether you like her or you hate her, does have the image of a very aggressive, negative politician, an independent, feel-good candidate. Trying to tear her apart right before people go to the polling booths isn't really helping the preconceived notions in that campaign. I think negative politics isn't really helping Sophie Mirabella there.
Now, getting on to one of our final talking point on media impact, this is really, we were talking about this in the prep, that this is kind of the first election campaign, not dominated, but where the 24-hour news cycle has really been strong. I mean, it's, you mentioned stuff like iView, and with Foxtel Go, you can watch Sky News without a subscription and things like that on there. So it's constant, the message that we've had now. It hasn't been 30-second blocks or radio spots in the afternoon, things like that. Do you think that there's any way that constant coverage has diluted the message perhaps this time and created this mixed, not quite clear big picture we've had?
Well, before when we were speaking, I suggested I think there's lessons to be learned from this entire campaign and from tonight going forwards for future elections. And I think this is going to be a big one, because this is a very different media landscape to what even we had 3 years ago. Now almost all your voters are on Twitter. So many people work in a place with ABC News 24, which seems to be very ubiquitous, or Channel 9 streaming news service, or Sky.
Cafe, pubs, whatever now.
They're all there. So even if you're not a politics junkie who's sitting down and tuning into every press conference and watching these dissections, you're at least seeing vision of yet another press conference and yet another, I'm not going to say faceless Labor or Liberal politician, but another person in a suit giving a stump speech, answering the same questions, cut to the same news anchor saying the same things. It all, I think, builds to a certain level of fatigue from the public, and if you're not on the same page with what you're saying.
Now, this is actually an issue we spoke to Lockie Harris about during the week, so I'll hear some more about this later. But for now, we just have to go to another quick break. It is 8:02, so we're up to, we've passed the first hour mark. We're having some more news coming, but we'll get to that after a quick break, so we'll throw to that now. Another song, Eric, come on. Whenever we're talking about songs. And we're back. Thanks for the quick break there, Chris, out the back. We are joined now by Kimberly Thompson, who is keeping us updated of all our social media happenings tonight. Kim, how is everything going on Twitter and Facebook and all those fun things at the moment?
Yeah, suitably curious. And there's some frenetic Twittering going on at the moment. But yeah, it's really interesting in this campaign. Twitter's become sort of a character within its own right. And it's really interesting when it's done well and really, really interesting when it's done badly as well.
So what are have you seen any kind of interesting tweets from pollies or journos, perhaps anyone starting to, preemptively at the moment still call anything? Or
Well, there's sort of been universal love fawned upon Anthony Green. He is trending currently. Lee Sales says he's just so damn good, and Latika Burke also putting the vote in for Anthony Green.
Maybe we should have put him on the ballot somewhere. But also, you've been on our Upstart account where we have been doing our election song throughout the day.
Yeah, our hashtag election playlist is getting a lot of love.
What are some of the better ones you've seen on there that we've had come through? Me and Eric have been keeping an eye on a couple. There have been some good ones. One of my favourites was just have to go to it. One of our someone who follows us through our basketball work, Tom Reed up in Sydney, who had "Vote or Die" by P Diddy, which is obviously a skit on South Park. So it isn't actually a real song, but I think that one probably can squeeze in there somewhere. Kim, what's your one?
From Tom Midwood, we've got "Everybody Wants to Rule the World," suitable. "Get Me Out of Here" by Jet, which I think is just a reference to the way everyone feels at the moment. But I think the winning entry so far is from Cal God, and it's "Wake Me Up When September Ends."
Interesting. Eric, have you thought of a second one for yourself yet?
I'll hold off, Liam. I'm going to come up with a super duper one by the end of the tonight.
I think I'll do the same. Kim, thanks for taking a bit of time out to join us, and you have to get back onto our Twitter account, make sure you're chatting to everyone and making sure we're all up to date with what's going on out there.
Yeah, and everyone has to get on election night bingo as well.
Anthony, despite being cautious, making what sounds like an encouraging pronouncement about your seat, can I give you a tentative congratulations?
Well, thanks very much. It's actually hard to hear what you've been.
Yes, I can.
People behind me are getting some news.
Now, you obviously have a lot of influence with your people at this stage. Perhaps you could ask them to, oh, well done. Yes, excellent. How obedient you are. Now, Adam Bant, just take us through what you think were the decisive issues in your seat during this campaign.
Well, we made it very clear in this campaign that elections shouldn't be a race to the bottom and a competition about who is able to beat up the most on refugees. Elections should be about offering visions for this country and how we are going to make this country better in the 21st century, and it seems that people have responded.
You've spent the last 3 years with a collection of crossbenchers and a very unusual arrangement in the House of Representatives. It looks tonight as though the result's going to be quite a bit more decisive than it was 3 years ago, but looks like you might still have some friends on the crossbenchers. Early figures look like Clive Palmer still a chance in Fairfax, so that's somebody to have lunch with in the cafeteria.
Well, I'm sure we'll get on fine. The last time I got elected, the first thing they did was sit me next to Bob Catter at the National Press Club. He got a steak and I got a bread roll, so I don't know what Clive Palmer's going to get.
Well, it sounds like he'll be back as well as Andrew Wilkie. Tell me, I know that this is largely a question for the Senate and it's not your chamber, but what do you make of the strong showing of these minor party candidates so far tonight?
Well, one of the pieces of feedback that I got throughout the whole election was that people are fed up with Labor in particular deciding to out-Abbott Tony Abbott. I mean, that's a losing game because there's nothing that guy won't do. And in the midst of all of that, we went to the election with a positive platform for a clean economy and a caring society. And I think people want that kind of positive vision back in Australian politics, and perhaps that's what they're voting for around the country as well.
So that was Adam Bant talking to the ABC, likely to be announced later on this evening as the winner of Melbourne, so he's retained that seat. Eric, it is almost 8:10. Polls are officially closed now. We've got a few more bits of news coming in. Jenny Macklin has retained her seat. Also now it's saying that Bob Catter's leading the seat of Kennedy. So after we had that swing a few moments ago, so we're switching our news a little bit around there, Eric.
It just goes to show how volatile polling is when there's only 15% of the vote.
That 24-hour news cycle. But we were able to sit down earlier in the week and speak to someone who knows all about that. Former Kevin Rudd Senior Press Secretary Lachlan Harris. So he chatted to us about the Kevin 07 campaign. Presidential campaigns have been adopted this sort of way in negative politics. But first off, we simply asked him what he thought of the campaign so far.
Yeah, look, I think it was always going to be tough for Labor. The reality is the kind of the civil war between Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard did the worst possible thing for the Labor Party. It damaged Kevin Rudd and it damaged Julia Gillard really badly, and they were Labor's best performers. And as a team, they were very, very formidable, but unfortunately, they've taken a lot of paint off each other over the last couple of years, and in the process, taken a lot of paint off Labor. And so I think that's shone through and kind of almost eclipsed anything Labor's tried to say during this campaign, so it's been very tough. On the other side, I think Abbott had a very poor campaign in 2010. I think he's very wooden, but I think he performed a lot better this time. There's no doubt about it. He was, he had to project a low-risk kind of credible alternative, and that's exactly what he's done this campaign. So he's certainly learnt from the mistakes of 2010 and hasn't repeated them, and that's why I imagine that will be reflected in the results later this evening. I think he's been forced into negativity by a lack of alternative options, and rather than the campaign, and Labor has to take responsibility for that fact. I don't think they set out wanting to be negative, but I think the reality is their alternative positive arguments just weren't comprehensible enough for people to kind of latch onto. They weren't successful in pushing people's attention to the future, which is what they needed to do to win. And so Plan B was this kind of push into cuts. And Plan Bs very rarely can win campaigns, and I don't think that tonight's going to be an exception. Yeah, look, it was Neil Lawrence who actually came up with the term Kevin 07, but the campaign itself was, I think, Labor had a very clear vision about what it wanted to do if it was elected into government. They were very, very clear about signing Kyoto, scrapping work choices, starting an education revolution and governing as fiscal conservatives, and that was universally accepted across the party. There was a huge amount of discipline about achieving those about wanting to govern in order to achieve those four goals. And that is probably what's lacking in this campaign, a clarity about why they want to govern again. Is definitely missing from this campaign, and once that clarity is missing, all the other smaller problems, the happenstances and circumstances of the campaign begin to overtake the strategy itself, and you get stuck in this day-to-day campaigning, story of the day sort of stuff, which you've seen over the last 5 weeks. No, I think they had no alternative. The reality is Labor was heading for an absolute dumping of the highest order. Their strongest card was Rudd, and obviously not strong enough, it seems, on the evidence at the moment to be. But no, I think they had very little choice. I think they hadn't properly prepared, and this is across the party, really a kind of genuinely agreed upon, universally accepted kind of agenda, forward-looking agenda, policy agenda, and so they had no alternative but to push the Rudd card. Look, the reality is getting rid of Rudd was an absolute disaster in 2010. It was a huge mistake, and not only did it destroy or seriously damage Rudd, it also seriously damaged Gillard. And that's unfortunately why they had to bring Rudd back. Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd are both very good performers. It was that ridiculous, terrible decision in June 2010 that Julia took part in to get rid of Rudd, which actually, Rudd got sacked, but Julia got destroyed on the first night. We didn't know it. It took us a couple of years to learn over the next 3 years just how much damage it did to Julia Gillard. And unfortunately, for that reason, Rudd had to come back. Labor was facing a drubbing of epic proportions, unbelievable proportions, 30, 35 seats, sort of stuff. I still think it's going to be incredibly tough, but if Labor gets anywhere north of 45 to 50 seats, then I think it will be considered mission successful in terms of returning to Rudd. Oh, look, I think, Rudd has the right to choose his own future. I think it's almost impossible to imagine him would be leader of the opposition following a loss, particularly if it was a loss of a significant magnitude. But ultimately, that's Rudd's decision to make. Personally, I hope for Rudd's sake that he does feel that, there's other things there's bigger sort of challenges for him outside of politics. I think he's had 2 goes at the Prime Ministership now. He's had some highlights, he's had some lowlights, he's had some great achievements that he can be very proud of. And I think for his sake, it would be better for him to kind of look, beyond the realms of politics. And I also think it would be better for the party. No, the reality is I think the Liberal Party has run an extremely small target, extremely uninteresting, extremely risk-free campaign, an election campaign, and they've done that for political reasons. And I think Labor hasn't been able to articulate a policy agenda because it simply does not. There's not a universal agreement and acceptance in the party about just what that agenda is. So, unfortunately, I think both parties have to take responsibility for the lack of vision in this campaign.
So that was former Kevin Rudd Press Secretary Lachlan Harris. I almost mixed Lockie and Lachlan into one hybrid word. But Eric, any quick takeaways from what you had to say from that there?
It was interesting to hear someone who was
obviously
involved
with
in
his
such
experience and stuff like that.
Such a successful campaign in 2007. It mustn't be easy watching so much of what he worked towards be squandered in what's been a pretty chaotic couple of weeks.
And he does mention he has other places besides just in there, say the debacle that was Kevin Rudd getting kicked out in 2010. So he still carries a flame from the sounds of it. But yeah, we have been giving, for the most part, the major parties some love tonight, but trying to focus on some small parties a bit, Eric, which, as you know, probably more important this election than ever, which leads us perfectly into introducing Bridget Rollerson, who's been looking into the minor parties over the past month or so as part of Upstart's election coverage. Bridget, welcome.
Thanks, Liam.
So for the first interview we have on deck for your Party Crasher series, where you spoke to all of our minor parties and emerging parties across Australia, is with the Rise Up party. So they're one of the more controversial ones. Is there anything we could look for or be focusing out on for this interview?
Well, this party's pretty interesting, and they have been largely in the media with their racial accusations. So the Rise Up Party's main policy is to abolish multiculturalism. Basically, as their slogan states, they want to keep Australia Australian and protect our country by stopping the apparent Islamisation of Australia. So they do have 96 candidates Australia-wide, which is actually pretty impressive for a new party, and have approximately 3,000 members. But along with 26 other policies on various issues, such as freedom of religion, which seems rather contradictory given their major policy, I spoke to Peter Vasiliou, who is the candidate for Hotham, and I asked him to shed some light on this major policy that proposes to eradicate multiculturalism.
So let's hear the best parts of that interview now.
The Rise Up Party was formed just a couple of years back, I think. The actual vision and the dream of having a party called Rise Up Party. Now, it started by Pastor Daniel Nalaya, who for many years had Rise Up meetings around Australia, but decided to enter into the political realm. And the reason he had this drive was because the two major parties seem to be the only choice, and they're really letting the country down right now. And so he pioneered this move to start Rise Up Australia Party to keep Australia Australian, with its intention to protect Australia and to return those things which we've lost in Parliament. We've lost our way. So everyone around him, the people, are not driven by image, they're not driven by money, they're not driven by retaining a position in government or retaining another term in government. What they're driven by is a passion for Australia and her people. So we're not a one-policy party. Our flagship policy is a multi-ethnic Australia. So that entails abolishing multiculturalism. So essentially what we're saying there is through multiculturalism, we have to embrace certain minority groups which are not embracing our way of life, our laws or our values. They actually embrace contrary laws, values and cultures. So multiculturalism provides a window or a gateway by which these minorities can demand their rights. So under multiculturalism, you're branded an intolerant racist. So you're not tolerant. if you don't tolerate everything that people want to bring in. But unfortunately, some people have values which are contrary to the Aussie way. For instance, Islam. The religion of Islam is culture, religion and law. So all three are combined, they're interwoven, and you can't get rid of one and keep the other. You have to keep all three. So if you don't embrace Sharia law, you're branded an intolerant racist because part of their religion is their law. So essentially, Sharia law is contrary to Australian law. So what we're saying there is it's un-Australian to chop someone's left hand off because they stole a piece of bread. But under the Sharia law, that's normality. That's something that they want to bring in. So there's a whole dynamic there of different things that we don't tolerate in the West that are diffusing into our system through multiculturalism. Recently, the Labor government was approached twice by the Islamic Federation of Australia. They were requesting Sharia law to be implemented in Australia. So there's actually a move in the Islamic community to overthrow our law system and bring in a dual legal system. And we've seen the ramifications of this in France, where Sarkozy condemned multiculturalism because 754 French zones are now Sharia zones, where a white person can't go on the streets, they get belted up and beaten. It's been condemned also in England, where Cameron said that multiculturalism has failed us. The Dutch Parliament also abolished multiculturalism and have now said if you come to Holland, learn the Dutch language, speak Dutch, assimilate, enjoy our way of life, be unified. So essentially the whole policy on multiculturalism is to abolish multiculturalism and to bring in a multi-ethnic Australia. A multi-ethnic Australia is, okay, I'm born overseas in Sri Lanka or something, I come into Australia, I continue to eat my cultural food. So, for instance, if you're Lebanese, you eat the roti. If you're Greek, you eat the souvlaki. If you're Italian, you eat the pizza. That's all fine. We bring these wonderful values and cultures into Australia, and we contribute to building Australia up into a great democracy that it is. But what we don't do is challenge Australian law and say, okay, Sharia law is better for Australia. This law is better for Australia. Because the reason why many people have come here is because their country is not in the same place as this great democracy here in Australia, which is, to be honest, the envy of the world. Everyone wants to come and live in Australia. So we want to keep Australia that way, and we want to encourage people to assimilate and to unify into Australian way of life.
So, Bridget, that was a Rise Up party. Who was your second interview that you've got for us tonight?
Well, next up, I interviewed the Hemp Party, which has actually a rather clever acronym because it stands for the Help End Marijuana Prohibition Party. So they've made a comeback for this year's election after failing to meet the member requirements for the past two elections. So each party, in order to register, needs 500 members. So they're a proud single-issue party. They began 20 years ago because they were fed up with the prejudice against cannabis users, and they have three major policy goals. So that is to decriminalise recreational cannabis, legalise it for medicinal purposes, and promote its industrial applications. So I spoke to the very passionate president, Michael Baudistone, the New South Wales Senate candidate.
Well, I'm pretty sure we know how this one's going to go, but let's hear some of that now.
20 years ago, 1993, because we were all absolutely fed up with the prejudice against cannabis users. God-given, beautiful herb, part of the planet, part of human use for history. For as long as we have history, cannabis has been there. All the first writing was on cannabis paper. Essentially, we're a one-issue party, which is to re-legalise cannabis in all forms. That's for all the industrial uses and medicinal and recreational and spiritual. Just, it should be re-legalised, a regulated industry, real health advice that's honest and people will respect. That's really what we're about, and it shouldn't be a crime in any way. We're not politically aligned. No, we're an independent party, totally, and I think we might never have got formed, except a lot of us were very disappointed in the Greens not making it more of a priority. to raise awareness, educate people, get the truth out there, get cannabis users a chance to vote on the issue, because the one place where they're anonymous is in the election booth, and also to talk to other parties about them getting a cannabis policy. And that's a big part of what we do. So all the parties have been talked to and encouraged and educated on getting an industrial, medical and recreational policy, if they will, together. So a big part of it is getting it on the agenda. If we can get it on the agenda in the media, even better, but certainly trying to get the public on the agenda. Like, really at the moment, we are pushing the Greens and Labor to talk about drug use again. It needs to be on the agenda, and it's like an elephant in the room for them. The last federal election, I think, was 2004, and then John Howard changed the rules. So if you didn't have a member of parliament, everyone got deregistered, and then you have to register again, which was quite difficult. We failed a couple of times because of the paranoia and people, but now that we're registered, and particularly because of online stuff, we've got a lot more members and donations, and we're a much stronger party. That's how come we're running in every state. In fact, it was a hemp party guy who went to the AEC a year or so ago and said, look, our members are paranoid, we get mail from the AEC and people change address. They deny being a member. There's paranoia. So why can't we join online? And lo and behold, a month later, the AEC said, everyone can join online now. So since then, we've got thousands of new members and donations and got a whole big online network happening. So really, I suppose the hemp party's there. It's a chance to have a protest vote and try to show politicians how important this issue is. And how, even broader, we think drug use is really a health issue, and the sooner we start trying to get it into that vein rather than a criminal view, the better it will be on a million fronts. Half of America's now got legal medical cannabis. So, the case in Australia is quite urgent. Let's get it there.
So, Bridget, that was the hemp party. You've got one more lined up for us. So last but not least, who are we going to hear from now?
Next, we're going to hear from the Animal Justice Party, which is Australia's first political party formed to advance animal rights issues. So they formed 2 years ago to represent the interests of animals because animals aren't allowed to vote. So their major political policy is to ban the live export of animals, but they have policies concerning almost every single animal or animal-related issue. So I spoke to Victorian Senate candidate Bruce Poon.
Let's hear the best parts of that now.
Particularly sprung out of the Belconnen kangaroo massacre, where a number of thousands of kangaroos were culled, slaughtered in the ACT, and there was no political party prepared to say, well, this actually shouldn't be happening. And so that provoked a number of people to say, well, if no political party is going to stand up for these animals, then we need a new political party. And so we formed the Animal Justice Party. We represent animals, so we will do whatever we can to get results for animals, to preference parties with good animal policies, and to try and win representation in the parliaments on behalf of animals. We're serious about getting that Senate seat. The last senator from Victoria was the LP, got 2.3% of the primary vote. So you don't actually need to get 14% or some enormous sort of primary vote to win a Senate spot if you have the right positioning and the right preference deals and you're lucky. We are doing everything we can to win in everywhere we're standing. For example, I've taken a year off work to work full-time party, to promote the party, to organise the party, and try and win as many votes as possible. We certainly have used social media a lot because being a minor party, we don't have a lot of money, so we can't use mass media, a lot. Yeah, we use Facebook mainly and Twitter to connect to a lot of our members and potential members. I would say we're probably, a reasonably youngish party, but then there's always a range. There's, I'm not young anymore, and there's plenty of people in the party who are span the range. We've got retired people through to students. We've got about 1,500 actual members join the party. Some of the universities have got animal advocacy groups at the university. Melbourne University has UMAPs, and La Trobe has one, and so on. And we've tried to connect with these groups and try and deal with them and politically and try and encourage them to actually get political on campuses as well. So it seems to us that we're frustrated animal activists who go, well, we're not getting anywhere here, we're not winning our campaigns, we need to get involved in politics where the real decisions are made. And I think the same applies on campuses, that sometimes, you can beg and you can argue and you can cajole, and then at the end of the day, you just don't win. You can't get K3 campus or whatever you want. But if you were to run and get some actual power, decision-making power on campus, you might find that these things become easier.
So that was the Animal Justice Party. We'll talk about what all these small parties mean for the Senate in just a minute, but we've got some news coming through. Labor has some bad news, Eric. They look like they were going to lose a few seats. Bass, Braddon, Petrie, Corangamite, which I think has been called. We're going to go there for some news in just a minute or so. And also Page. There's a bit of a swing across Victoria for the NLP. Same story in South Australia, where it's 52.8 to 47.2, a coalition lead. Tasmania, pretty close, but it looks like it's 50.4 coalition, 49.6, ALP. Clive Palmer is leading in Fairfax, so that could be close. Ticket to the big time. And also Sophie Mirabella, who we are keeping a special eye on tonight, is apparently looking like she might be in trouble in Indi, Eric. Any big surprises in that one?
Well, look, I think Tasmania is an interesting one to watch here. It has swung. I mean, you look at a seat like Braddon, and it has swung between Liberal and Labor over the last couple of years, and Bass as well. Well, ones that people were keeping an eye on because they thought Labor was going to lose them. And you have to think that they've already started losing seats throughout Australia, and they have to be hoping for good things in Queensland here, because with these swings we're seeing in all the other states already, they're running out of places to set up a fortress, or a tiny fortress even, in the next term.
Just a foothold of any sort.
Yeah, anything, because they're losing seats throughout Australia here, and you said bad news. I think it's gonna go from bad to worse.
Just a couple of other quick updates. Bill Shorten has been re-elected in Maribyrnong, so pretty close to us here, not far away.
Yep.
Which is good for Bill. Bruce Scott has been re-elected for the 9th time in the seat of Maranoa. I hope I'm getting that one right, up in Queensland. But we do have that cross ready with Sarah Henderson of the Liberal... Henderson, so I've got that name wrong twice now. Of the Liberal Party. She's won the seat of Corangamite and was talking to Sky News just a moment ago.
Well, look, we're very thrilled. We ran a very strong grassroots campaign right across this vast electorate, and we're very proud. There have been so many people, so many volunteers working so hard on this campaign, and with my son Jeremy here and my partner Simon, and I've had wonderful support, and we're very, very proud.
What's been the key factor, do you think, in this result for you?
Well, look, there's no doubt that Labor has been on the nose, and in Geelong we have suffered thousands of job losses, of course exacerbated by the fact that Ford here is closing its manufacturing. The carbon tax has been very toxic in Geelong because people understand that it is hurting manufacturing, it is hurting industry, and despite all the spin we had from Labor, people knew on the ground that it was really hurting.
So that was Sarah Henderson, got it right the third time, talking to Sky there. A big win out in Corangamite, winning as easily as soon as she did in one of the big key seats everyone looks at. So great news for the Liberal Party. For saying some bad news so far for the ALP. Obviously, it's going the other way on the other side of the aisle.
Absolutely. Corangamite, most marginal. They'll be happy to have that in the bag for sure. Turning our attention back towards these minority parties that we've seen spring up for this election. Bridget, why do you think minority parties have been so successful in this campaign?
Well, I think this year we have the highest number of disillusioned voters, and this apparent lack of trust that Australia has towards the two-party preferred. People are looking for other places to cast their votes. So because we're such a lucky country to have a preferential voting system, and as much as Tony Abbott says, we're not actually wasting our vote. So every minor party I spoke to repeated this same notion that their members were fed up with not being represented in Parliament. So they created a political party to address this.
So, looking at this result, it's obviously it's quite an outlier here. Should we be viewing this as just a one-off, or is this a sign of an ongoing trend? Can we expect this to be repeated in 3 years' time?
Well, I think even if this is a fad, it greatly concerns the major parties, with Abbott using one of his last media appearances to persuade Australia not to vote for the minor parties. So he says that they'll damage our country and that it's really a waste of a vote. So he's obviously concerned, which suggests that it's something that's going to be likely to affect a hung parliament. But I don't think it is, because we've seen, as we've seen a couple of times in the past, because of the way the Senate election system works, they can actually get a seat in the parliament from a very small share of the vote.
So there's obviously a lot of narrow interests being represented by these people, and they're going to be new to the job if they're elected. Can we expect these minority parties to be legitimate contributors if elected?
Well, that's the concern, because there's so many single-issue parties, such as the Voluntary Euthanasia Party or Bullet Train for Australia, who are purely in the political realm to legalise one thing, which is fantastic for those passionate people, but it can be hard to trust their ability to vote informedly, and perhaps their credibility on different issues can be questioned. But then again, not everyone is Clive Palmer and aims to be the next Prime Minister.
But so you've obviously spent a bit of time over the last couple of weeks speaking to these people. What's your feeling, having spoken to them? Do you think they'd actually be effective parliamentarians?
I think they will. A lot of parties, as much as they are pushing for one single issue, they've actually devised a range of policies on every single other issue, such as the Animal Justice Party. They've got a policy on most issues looking through the prism of animals.
Okay, but would you be satisfied if they were representing you in Parliament? If they were your local member or a senator for your state, would you be happy that they'd actually be across everything and be an effective parliamentarian?
I think the positive of this is the Senate would actually act as a house of review, and you'd actually have different parties voting representative of their electorate rather than representative of their parties, I guess. But otherwise, I'm not too sure. Maybe single issue parties, I wouldn't be so trusting that they'd be able to represent myself on a range of issues.
But you at least think that it's a win for democracy that we're getting all these different voices heard.
I definitely think that.
Oh, that's good. It's been an interesting to follow you speaking to all these minority parties over the last couple of weeks, and yeah, thanks for coming on.
I think we should have added democracy, or a day of democracy in action in some way to our upstart bingo scorecard. That's it's a pretty commonly heard one. Bridget, thanks for chatting with us. And as Eric said, thanks for digging into these minor parties for us over the last few weeks. It's going to be a massively important few years for them to see really if they're a viable alternative in some sort of way. So it'll be very interesting to watch.
Thanks, guys.
So now a bit more news coming in, Eric. This is a pretty big one. Well, maybe not too big. Julia Gillard has broken her 58-day Twitter drought, which is Twitter took to announcing. She did that to congratulate Joanne Ryan on her election as a member for Lawler. So and said, she'll be a strong, articulate voice for the community and that sort of thing. But it's I was kind of sarcastic a little bit in introducing that, but it is good to see that somewhere tonight, Julia Gillard's sitting back, keeping a track of news, probably having a glass of red wine and updating her Twitter account somewhere.
I think that, at some point later in the night, we will be turning more towards broader views of what's happened and what's going forward. And I think one of the saddest parts that we will remember about this campaign is what's happened to Julia Gillard. She certainly made mistakes, but I don't think she deserved the way she was treated. And for somebody who is such an effective leader and managed to really, as Barry was talking about before was really managed to get a lot of legislation through the House, to have been really rendered mute in this campaign and to have just been sidelined completely into irrelevance is really sad, I think. So, you know, I'm hopeful that she manages to find some. I think I noticed she's an emeritus professor in Adelaide now, and she can do something else. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of mandate is inherited for this new member for Lawler, because there's very conflicting memories that she's inheriting there.
Now, while we're keeping an eye on our TweetDeck account here, Malcolm Turnbull has apparently had what I think is probably one of the quotes of the day so far, that Labor makes decisions in smoke-filled rooms, even though nobody smokes in them anymore, or maybe they do. So a bit of a cryptic 140 characters there from Malcolm. Not quite sure what he's getting at. Maybe his new internet policy will help us figure that one out. And David Emmett is apparently out in Brunswick listening to us on Upstart, and he's calling us bubbly while he's playing Mario Kart. So it's a bit of a nice one for us. And so, yeah, we're keeping a track of all these songs coming in as well. Keep sending through whatever you have, and, yeah, we can try to get some good shout-outs later in the night. Have you thought up a second one of those yet?
No. I'm going to keep you hanging there, Liam. It's going to be worth it.
The suspense is killing me. Bridget, that means you're on the hot seat. Have you got a song at all? She furiously shakes her head as her headset is off across the deck.
DJ Bridget's begging out.
If I do have to say one, I think I will go with Suicidal Thoughts from Notorious B.I.G., which is another Labor song for the night. I will think of a coalition one later, maybe We Are the Champions or something like that. I will try to keep it balanced. For now, though, we are going to throw to another podcast of Nick Bisley. He spoke with Daniel Flitton, who is obviously from The Age, one of their senior correspondents, earlier, a couple of weeks ago now, about asylum seekers. So let's hear the best bits of that now.
The real Kevin is coming out in many respects, the sense that there was a policy that was arrived at very, very rapidly. In many respects, he kind of, I think prior to the election, he did a carbon copy of what Gillard did in 2010, where you take over in difficult circumstances, you've got these sort of intractable issues that you're trying to tick off and push off the table, and then go to the election and hope and pray that people have a very short attention span, or the difficult policy detail will come after the election and then you can grapple with it. What we're finding out with PNG and with Nauru is that what I thought the deal was that we struck, what they thought the deal we struck was in fact different. And the problem here is not just one of implementation and is this going to work. From an election point of view, all of a sudden an issue that they thought was a winner, or at least one that the coalition had the running on for a long period of time, is now back on the table. Not only is the other boats not being stopped and all that kind of imagery, the Tories have got evidence to back up their claim and say this is a shambolic government that can't basically do policy.
You can also go further on this, is that, you know, there's good politics and bad policy. And I think when it was first announced, the PNG solution came off as good politics because they were able to sort of go even harder than Abbott was. And you could see just in terms of the coalition's response for the first few days, they really did flounder. Their main line was, oh yeah, it's not a bad idea, but we could do it better. That seemed to be what they were saying for the first few days. So it did unsettle, and it really did sort of recast some of the political debate for a while there. But it's bad policy, in my view. It's very bad policy that shifts a burden onto the Pacific countries that are involved in this, that really, from Australia's point of view, having spent all these years as an aid partner talking about eliminating corruption and trying to prioritise aid development areas, you know, make sure that money was being well spent, all of a sudden there's this flood of cash coming in for areas that you wouldn't really think are the key priorities. There's a lot of burden coming across from Australia, to take Nauru for example, for them to do the processing of asylum seekers, for them to work out whether or not these people are refugees. They don't have any infrastructure, any bureaucratic infrastructure set up to handle this. And now we're almost a year on from people first being sent to Nauru, and there's still not been a single determination. As a cash cow, Nauru makes $1,000 per asylum seeker per month. Now there's 543 there now, or thereabouts.
How many people are there on Nauru?
About 10,000. It's an extraordinary amount of money that they're getting. Abbott is talking about 5,000 people being held on Nauru. That's $5 million a month, just in visa fees. That's before you spend the money on maintaining and building the camp, before you spend the money on feeding people, staffing costs, all that sort of thing. Just on visa fees alone, straight to Nauru. What's this money going to be spent on? That's a real question. You know, there's not a lot of evidence that Nauru has in the past spent its wealth wisely, and there's not a lot of evidence at the moment, at least, that they're going to spend it wisely this time around either.
Sort of perverse stimulus program. No, I think the electoral politics of this trumping all policy rationality, and it's gotten into such a strange space that things that have hitherto been absolutely fundamental pillars of policy, whether it's around governance, around aid, around transparency, and even just around functionality and value for money.
Well, retrospectiveness is another aspect now too, because the coalition's talking about reinstating TPVs, or temporary protection visas, for this group that they call the legacy group, which is the 30,000 who've arrived between August last year and July this year, so between the sort of Nauru and PNG announcements. And that's an extraordinary thing in a Western democracy, to be pushing laws back retrospectively.
Yeah, I think there's some quite disconcerting points above and beyond, I think, the underlying irresponsibility of an extraordinarily wealthy country like our own that is completely selling the principles and complex reality of this problem up the river of marginal electoral voters' preferences. I mean, it's just really, really disappointing that you've got a country that's never been richer, never been better off, that is basically subcontracting this stuff out in a really careless and haphazard way.
I think the polls tell you that it is a big issue and people rate it, but do they do that because they keep being told it? There's a vicious cycle in all of this, because it becomes a bigger issue because it's being talked about, because the parties are trying to outdo one another. And don't forget too that there has been historically an extraordinary number of boat arrivals. Aside from, you know, the debates about whether or not Australia is taking its fair share, or comparison between Australia and what happens in Spain, for instance, and that sort of thing. I mean, ultimately, if you look at the historical numbers just in the last 2 years, the 16,000 arriving, it vastly dwarfs even what was the height just before 2001 in Tampa, which was 5,000. There's a lot of people coming. There's a falseness to the debate. The truth is, if you were only interested from a safety of life perspective, you would do a lot more on the open waters in terms of making sure that the journey is safe. You wouldn't burn boats that arrive, you wouldn't prosecute crews, that sort of thing. This is an election issue first and foremost, and that's why the PNG solution's put into place. That's why the Nauru thing is there. It's not about saving lives, or not principally about saving lives. Saving lives becomes a convenient rhetoric to cover this up. In the end, we've been having this debate on and off, mostly on, in this country now for 12 years and longer, and I find it depressing that we'll probably still be having it 12 years hence, because I don't think that the smugglers are going to stop regardless of what the parties do, because the truth is now, if you're sending 16,000 people, and let's say the number is around about 5,000 per head, that's a lot of money that you're making. There's a lot of pockets that are getting lined. There's a lot of bribes that are changing hands. A lot of people are getting rich over this. There's a big incentive for people to keep going. Even through the Howard years, the people smugglers kept testing whether they could get boats to Australia. So I don't think that the issue is going to go away.
The politics of it are going to continue like this until such time as you get a sort of bipartisan position a la the end of the White Australia policy.
You do have a bipartisanship between the parties now that you didn't have after 2001 to 2007. And the bipartisanship between the parties is the Pacific solution. This is the big drive now. And so the Greens might make some ground in terms of picking up some of the left disaffected votes. But is that going to be enough to keep this as a national issue again? I'm not sure, because, you know, despite what I just said about, you know, we might have 12 more years of this debate, if Labor's not agitating against it and then giving the opportunity that the coalition has now taken to turn this back on Labor, maybe it doesn't stay as such a big issue. We should talk about defence, though, very quickly. There's things that are missing in this campaign are extraordinary. You know, there's been no debate about defence issues. There's been very little debate about foreign policy issues aside from the people smuggling. But it does seem extraordinary that at this time of sort of such consequential international change, that neither of the parties feel the need to sort of explain what's going on in the world and why they would be better able to manage Australia at this time. So we're very insular looking at present as a nation.
Again, that was La Trobe University's Nick Bisley discussing the asylum seeker issue as part of his Australia Decide series. Eric, while we're listening to that, I think it's official. The Age, ABC and The Guardian are all calling this a coalition victory. So after it was called by Anthony Green pretty much about, 6:45, would have been 7 o'clock, it seems like it's a done deal now. I mean, it's over. They're saying, The Guardian on their front page is saying a 4 to 6% swing, which is obviously a very drastic switch. So, yeah, I think Tony Abbott's officially our Prime Minister-elect at the moment, I think, isn't he?
Yeah, that is the official term until he goes and has his sit down with the Governor-General in a couple of days. So it's what we've been expecting for weeks at
Still
this
feels
point.
strange saying it though, doesn't it?
Of course, and it's like when we get into a new year and we all write the year wrong for the first month or so. It's going to take a while for Tony Abbott to settle into being a Prime Minister, and it's going to take a while for us to get used to him. I mean, this is obviously very exciting for a man who is very close to John Howard, someone who is one of his political, idols, mentors.
You'd think he'd probably be one of the first calls he made. It wouldn't be that surprising if he gave John a quick call.
I wouldn't be surprised if he turns up at a press conference later on or a speech. I mean, he was very influential in Abbott's political career. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how closely he mirrors Abbott. I mean, one of the bars that has been set for this election, I mean, all the newspapers today were not debating what's going to happen. They were really talking about how many seats. And the bar for Tony Abbott, they were saying, has been set at what happened when John Howard booted Paul Keating out of office, and in a very, very decisive manner. And it's that kind of 20-seat gains, not margin, 20-seat gained over Labor that really is going to be the testing point for how successful people think this campaign has been. If you look at the ABC website, they're currently predicting, 87 seats in favour of the coalition and 59 for Labor, which, gives them almost 30. So that's a romping.
It's we were just saying that was one of our favourite words, and this is an absolute thumping that's being dished out at the moment. The Guardian saying, as I said, a 4 to 6% swing to the coalition, much bigger in some areas. They refer to him, just to quote a couple of things in this article they've got here going at the moment, that he was a relentlessly negative opposition leader who won the job with a pledge not to recognise Labor's 2007 mandate, but now who promises a conflict-weary electorate, calm, stable, grown-up government. Do you think in the earliest embers of a Tony Abbott prime ministership, as we are at the moment, well, soon to be, that sort of thing is possible, that approach?
Well,
which we will talk about this more later, so I don't want to spoil it too much.
We've got plenty of time to dissect Tony, the Prime Minister, and it's difficult to see. And I think one of the really key challenges for people in analysing Tony Abbott is he's really been wrapped up in cotton wool through this campaign. He seems to have been hidden. There's this feeling that people have been hiding Tony Abbott from key
not going
media.
On Q&A and all those sort of
and
things.
Even hiding him from the people. You don't see Tony Abbott doing those walk and talks down the street, meeting the fruit and veg guy, and laughing with the school. He's always in schools and in offices and things where it's enclosed and they can control who's getting in contact with Tony Abbott. You can't do that forever. He's the Prime Minister. You got to let him go out and do things. And I think he has proven himself, as Barry was saying. He has really met all the challenges that have been set on him. We
might not have set the challenges too high, but he has still met them on his own accord. Yeah.
He was obviously very widely ridiculed for getting torn apart by Lee Sales on 7:30 last year in one of the great political interviews of the year.
Political takedown.
Yeah, he handled her very capably in 2 interviews in the last couple of weeks. He's been on, I've listened to him on a number of ABC shows and other ones where he has faced strong cross-examination and come up trumps. So, this is starting to look like a very, very solid leader and a very solid win for somebody who has met every challenge that, the doubters have thrown at him.
Okay, again, this is touching on things we're going to discuss later, but apparently Tony Burke, who is working as part of Sky News' coverage tonight on the desk, has categorically ruled himself out of ever standing for the Labor leadership. Obviously, that is something we're going to talk about later in the evening, as I mentioned, but how quickly the worm turns, so to speak. They're already, that next step is he'll be trying to challenge Abbott in 3 years' time.
Absolutely. And another thing we'll be talking about later in the night is the Senate, which obviously, we talked before about the infinite ballot paper to vote for your senator. I mean, in Victoria, we had 97 boxes to fill out if you wanted to vote below the line. And that's going to be something that's going to take a lot longer, perhaps more than a week, to really emerge the picture of what Tony Abbott will be dealing with next year there. But even then, Nick Xenophon, a key independent senator in South Australia, has apparently already started to, barter with different people about what would happen if he held the power in a minority Senate. So, clearly people are already looking ahead from tonight and starting to plan out the next weeks, months, years of outcome after what we've seen tonight.
Now, just quickly as well, to get some news in, we did just hear a few moments ago from Barnaby Joyce, who was announced as the winner of New England, as we said earlier, in in a massive victory for Barnaby now. He goes into the lower house after spending a bit of time in the Senate. We're going to take that interview now and hear it from Sky News a few moments ago.
Well, I'm looking forward to doing the best job I can for the people of New England, first and foremost, making sure that the respect that's been given to me, that I earn it and that I deliver back for them. That's first and foremost, that I continue to walk humbly and work hard for the people. But on top of that, we've got to make sure that we turn the nation around, Spearsy. That is the serious side of what we have in front of us. If we don't do that, we're for the high jump. And my job is to make sure that I put myself in a position that delivers the best back for my seat, for the New England, and also for the nation. Apart from that, the one big change that will happen is I get more time to spend in my own bed, because getting around a seat is vastly easier than getting around a state.
So that was Barnaby Joyce talking after being announced. Not sure if he's been announced yet, but he's calling it as a victory for himself there out in New England. Eric, he's a bit of an interesting character, Barnaby. When we were lucky enough to go up to Canberra a bit earlier this year, we did see one of his door stops, I believe.
Yeah, we did.
What do you make of Barnaby as a lower house representative now?
Look, I think there are things that Barnaby does very well, and there are things that Barnaby in the past hasn't been capable of doing. Whether that changes in the next few years, we'll wait and see. He's now obviously returning to a position of power. When he was the shadow, I think it was finance minister, he was really widely ridiculed for the lack of understanding he demonstrated over concepts of federal debt and things like that, sovereign debt, I think it might have been. And it went to the point where Liberal Party members started referring to a gaffe as doing a Barnaby. And when he was pulled out of that key portfolio role and was really just able to kind of freelance and go out and run his talking points without having to be hard on policy, he was great. He's very good on Q&A. I mean, you and I both enjoyed his performances there, where he's really just able to play to the crowd.
He does seem kind of, without sounding too strange, almost like a naturally charismatic sort of guy.
Absolutely.
He's good at dealing with people. He's good at making people feel important, which is a very good trait for a politician.
When we were in Canberra and that doorstop that we saw, you're talking about, we saw quite a few that weekend. They were very serious and people standing there looking down the camera, not,
reading off notes and just,
trying to seem very stern.
Earlier sort of comments. Yeah.
Barnaby laughed off a question. Someone asked him a question, he just laughed at them and said, "He's serious." And that's the kind of thing that attracts people to him. I mean, like I suggested, maybe he isn't the most policy-focused guy, but he clearly is somebody who energizes an element of the Australian population. People like him. People think that he's different to your standard Polly. He's maybe somebody who can be trusted more because he is outside of that mold and he says wild things, which, although they upset his party, do appear to impress, the people who just want to hear politicians say things that they seem to believe in rather than just be towing party lines all the time. So there is also this entire narrative of Barnaby potentially being the Deputy Prime Minister here. Warren.
Yeah, I was going to go to that next. I mean, does this perhaps raise the Warren Truss handover sort of issue a little bit more than perhaps? I mean, he has always said that Barnaby would never challenge Truss to be the leader of the National Party. I think he's almost a personal debt of gratitude sort of thing there, saying he's never going to kind of go for the guy above him. But do you think now it becomes more of an issue?
I think we've learnt, if nothing else, over the last 6 years that don't listen to politicians when they tell you that they're not going to challenge for something. They're going to do whatever they can to.
Depends on who's circulating the petition at which time and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely in play. When you read what people are saying, they seem to think that there is a very real chance that Barnaby, being the popular, charismatic guy that he is, not many people really seem to know Warren Truss outside of the politically keen, that Barnaby could really be making a push, and with that deal that the Nationals have with the Liberal Party, he could be Deputy Prime Minister.
Now, Eric, we are still standing by waiting for Kevin Rudd's speech, which is reportedly imminent. But as we said, as everyone else is, we're all still waiting for that one. What we're going to do now is quickly go to a bit of a montage we put together of some of the gaffes of this campaign, but also a few of the more famous audio moments in the last 3 years or so. So we'll go to that one now.
In recent years, politics has failed the Australian people. In fact, it's been holding our country back. And all this must stop.
No one, however smart,
however well educated, however experienced, is the suppository of all wisdom. The statements that need to be taken absolutely as gospel truth is those carefully prepared, scripted.
They're young, they're feisty, I think I can probably say have a bit of sex appeal.
I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition went outside in the front of Parliament and stood next to a sign that said, "Ditch the witch." I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition stood next to a sign that described me as a man's bitch. I was offended by those things. Misogyny, sexism, every day from this Leader of the Opposition. Every day, in every way, across the time the Leader of the Opposition has sat in that chair and I've sat in this chair, that is all we have heard from him.
People that have a bit of...
I'm not saying that our culture, our traditions are perfect, but we have to respect them. And my idea is to build on the strengths of our society, and I support, by and large, evolutionary change. I'm not someone who wants to see radical change based on the fashion of the moment.
Saying the polling's rigged.
Well, of course polling's rigged in Australia. Rupert Murdoch owns Newspoll, he owns Galaxy Poll, and the media tries to set the agenda and tries to determine the result of an election before it's been held. That's not a democracy, it's up to the people. We'll win a lot more seats than 15. There's no doubt about that, and people are looking for a change. I mean, the current lot is so boring. You know?
So you're saying there's some sort of a fraud being perpetuated out there?
Well, there has been.
With 3,000 Australians doing the Kokoda track each year, I was one of them way back then, and I'm a survivor.
I don't oppose Islam as a country, but I do feel that their laws should not be welcome here in Australia.
The old parties are leading us into a legal quagmire and international shame with their willingness to play politics with the lives of people seeking asylum. That Labor can give up on such basic human principles and human rights in the rush to an election is the clearest evidence yet that they can no longer be trusted to stand up for what matters, but will do whatever it takes to claim power.
4 years and he's finally woken up to the fact that the vast majority of these people are not fair income refugees, they're economic migrants, pure and simple.
The coalition government can stop the boats.
Turn back the boats.
Turn back the boats, we're safe to do so, yes. And we have a plan, we have a 6-point plan to make sure that we do stop the boats.
6 points, could you run through them for us?
Well, I can run through all the details of the points, but look, the main thing is...
The 6 points, the 6 points.
Under Kevin Rudd, the boats...
The 6 points. Turn back the boats?
Look, here's the thing. The boats started under Kevin Rudd.
And the 6 points are?
Well, one of the points would be, the key point will be stopping the boats. We're safe to do so. We have a plan to stop the boats. It is under the Labor Party.
Forget about Labor, we're talking about the Liberal Party. What are the other 5 points?
Well, look, well, we have a plan to stop the boats, and I've answered that.
Well, look, if you stop the boats, you stop the smokes, don't you?
All right, I've just one final point on this.
Very quickly.
Very
Does this
final
guy
point.
ever shut up?
Eric, I think by the end of the night, some people might be asking that very same question about either or perhaps both of us, but we'll have to wait a couple of hours before we get to that. And of course, James Diaz will live on in infamy for his 6 pillars he couldn't name 5 of. But getting away from those gaps, we're joined again now by Barry Cassidy at a presumably very busy, chaotic ABC headquarters. Barry, what's the mood like down there at the moment?
Well, it's I guess to sum the thing up, it's Labor has been beaten very badly, but not as badly as most people thought they would be beaten. The damage in Queensland wasn't as quite as bad as they thought because Wayne Swan has survived, Kevin Rudd has survived. In fact, the losses in Queensland have been very limited. In New South Wales, it's pretty interesting. The worst case scenario from some of the predictions earlier on was that Labor would lose 10 or 12 seats. the Treasurer has held on. It looks like Labor win Eden Monero, and of course they won Greenway because the Liberals picked a dud candidate. So in the end, though, the coalition has had a comfortable victory, and they will have quite a big working majority, but not quite as big as perhaps some people expected.
Now, Barry, you sounded a little bit surprised that Kevin Rudd looks like he is going to hold Griffith. Were you expecting him to perhaps lose that one tonight?
Well, the early indications were some of the exit polling that was being done suggested was 50-50 in that seat. Well, it was nothing like that in the end. Kevin Rudd won it reasonably comfortably. I think there'd be some in the Labor Party who probably thought it might have been easy all round if he hadn't, because, of course, that keeps alive the whole Kevin Rudd-Julia Gillard issue and keeps alive the prospect of Kevin Rudd wanting to continue as the leader when a lot of the people in the party you would think would want to draw a line under that period and get on with it.
Well, that kind of perfectly goes into what we had next was, is this the end for Kevin? I mean, realistically, could we envision him staying on as an opposition leader, or...?
Well, there's no precedent for somebody losing as badly as this and staying on as leader. But then with Kevin Rudd, he tends to belt precedents around. But Greg Combay was on the ABC tonight, and he'll be saying more in the next couple of days, I understand it. But he just went for Kevin Rudd straight away. He just talked about the destabilisation that had hurt the Labor Party over a long period of time. So there'll be those who will take that view of Kevin Rudd. There'll be others who will defend him and say, well, he probably did better than Julia Gillard would have done, so it was all worthwhile. But the fact is, Labor has lost badly, and they have to look ahead to the next generation.
So looking back at now what has been 6 years of fairly tumultuous Labor leadership, how do you think history will remember the prime ministerships of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard?
I don't think history will be kind to Kevin Rudd. I think the longer time goes on, it'll be realised that he was disappointing in his first term and then came in at 50-50 in the second term, and then that collapsed in a campaign. And he won't really have anything to point to, up from the apology to Aborigines, as I mentioned before, but no real policy initiative to point to. Julia Gillard, I think history will be kinder to her because at least she had some policy achievements like the NDIS and education reform and the Murray-Darling plan, and these are long-term initiatives that she'll be able to point to. And I think that the question that Greg Combay raised tonight is a critical question internally within the Labor Party. How good would she have done if she'd been left alone? If Kevin Rudd had left her alone, how good would she have done in this election? And there's no answer to that question, but it's worth raising just the same.
One of the things that when we're talking about Rudd before that Eric referred to him as was a bit of a flame out at this point, considering how hot he started, obviously in 2007. Is part of his legacy perhaps that he's, to put it crudely, one of the ultimate kind of sizzle politicians without really much substance?
Yeah, I think it took the electorate about a little less than 2 years to wake up to him. They elected him, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around in 2007. He beat one of the most successful Liberal leaders of all time. But within 2 years, the electorate had worked him out, and they'd had enough of him. And yet somehow he managed, by keeping Julia Gillard's vote down, he managed to persuade enough people in the Labor Party that he still had it, that he could return to 2007. Well, he never did. The moment he became leader again, he reminded people not of Kevin 2007, but Kevin 2010, and that's the way they voted.
Clearly the Labor Party are not crazy about Kevin Rudd, but perhaps they reinstalled him under the hope of saving the furniture, as people have been putting it. Do you think now that it's all done and dusted, they have nothing to gain by protecting Kevin Rudd anymore? Do you think we'll see more of what we've seen from Combay tonight, you're saying, from other Labor members over the next few weeks?
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And in the end, he was booked to save the furniture, and in the end, he saved a few beanbags in Queensland. That's about it. That's not good enough, and so I doubt they'll entertain re-electing him.
Now, one of the big issues for Abbott immediately, well, not immediately, but in his first term, Barry, will be the minority Senate that's going to come up. How do you think that he can deal with that sort of problem straight away?
Well, first of all, he's very lucky that he doesn't have to deal with the independents in the House, that he's got a big enough majority to ignore them, because Clive Palmer will be one of those now, and that will be an absolute hoot. Clive Palmer in the federal parliament. Will the guy even turn up? That's the thing.
He might twerk on the way in.
Would he expose himself to the discipline of going to Parliament for 22 weeks of the year? The Clive Palmer thing, if you've got Bob Catter, Clive Palmer and Adam Bandt sitting there on the independent benches, that'll be a sight to behold. In the Senate, I think what Abbott will probably do is pretty much ignore it until the new Senate comes in July next year, or he might want a double dissolution. He might want to reinforce his mandate. I doubt it. I think he'd be smart to wait for the new Senate, and we haven't really seen much focus on that tonight to know what that will look like. But it looks as if there's just a chance that Tony Abbott will be able to deal with independents minus the Greens, ignore the Greens, and just deal with a group of independents beyond the Greens, and that will make it slightly easier for him.
Do you think that tonight's result would make Abbott a little bit more confident to go to a double dissolution?
Yeah, look, it might. It's he's talked about it a lot, so you can't rule it out. He wants to get rid of the carbon tax, and he's blocked in that effort. Then less than a year from now, he could, before the new Senate comes into place. If he feels as if that would reinforce his big majority and give him another 3 years beyond that, he just might.
Now, finally, with the minority Senate issue, do you think that this could ultimately present a really big issue for Tony Abbott just due to the fact that he was such a successful and such a negative opposition leader? I mean, surely Labor members in the Senate and in the lower house who have just spent the last 5 years being punching bags for him, they've got to be relishing the opportunity to return some over the next few years.
Yeah, you'd think they'd probably say, well, it worked for him, so we might as well give it a shot as well and see if it works for us. But look, I think the situation could have been worse for Tony Abbott if he was faced with the prospect of having to needing the Greens' support to get legislation through. I don't think beyond July next year that will happen, but we haven't seen anything meaningful from the Senate to get an answer on that. But based on what we're seeing in the House of Representatives, Clive Palmer will get up a senator in Queensland for sure, and that'll be the former rugby league player who will beat Bob Katter's candidate, who was a country music singer. So the rugby league player will beat the country music singer, and that'll be, and then you'll have that guy along with the DLP from Victoria and Nick Xenophon in South Australia calling the shots.
Barry, just quickly moving away from that, one of the big things you have obviously tomorrow morning is ABC's Insiders, just special 90 minutes one tomorrow. Are you glad to see that Bill Shorten won tonight, so you won't have to deal with quite as perhaps grumpy or cantankerous Bill in the morning?
No, but it'll be really interesting to have Bill on now the results are known, because there are a lot of questions for Bill Shorten, certainly around whether or not it was worth the leadership change, whether it was worth throwing Julia Gillard overboard. That's one question. Of course, he was instrumental in that. But the second question is leadership, and of course, he's the absolute key to that. Chris Bowen has held on to his seat in New South Wales, so he remains in the leadership mix. So now I think it'll be a contest between Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen, provided Kevin Rudd doesn't complicate it by wanting to stay on as leader.
Now, Barry, I'm sure you've got much to get back to, so thanks for taking some time out to chat to us for a second time tonight.
No problem.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to watching you tomorrow morning. Thanks, Barry.
Okay, thanks, guys.
So as we said, so that was Barry Cassidy of ABC's Insiders there. Eric, some pretty interesting comments to come from that. We're going to go to some news in just a second, but what do you make of that so far, some of his initial comments there?
I'm still getting over the concept of Clive Palmer.
You did shake your head pretty furiously when Clive Palmer was announced, or not announced, but said to be a...
we were speaking before with Bridget about how this is a win for democracy in a certain sense, introducing other voices into the parliament. And I think, although somebody like a Bob Katter might be colourful and he might not be popular for everyone, he does at least represent a portion of the Australian population. And
he's a serious candidate that perhaps presents himself in a less than serious way, I think is a good way to describe Katter, where Palmer's just, with all due respect to Mr. Palmer, seems like a bit of a joke.
Yeah, I don't know how many bazillionaire people who want to reconstruct Jurassic Park and the Titanic feel like they'll be well represented.
If that's his these are good ways to spend my money. I don't consider him someone I want in charge of or any say on the federal economy.
And just generally, my concern with somebody like that is it has really been a personality-driven campaign. There's been, somebody, he says, oh, well, I think I would be able to fix Australia's economic problems. How would you be able to do that, Mr. Palmer? I don't have to answer that. I've got a strong record of economic management in the private sector. And that's fine, you do, but you're also asking the Australian people to give you their trust, and you've got to give them something more than that.
Which is something we saw, the business record, something that Mitt Romney tried to do in America in the election last year, but it's obviously a bit different. But now we're going to go to some news. You called this one a bit earlier, Eric, with John Howard has came out and spoke to Sky, I believe the grab came from, saying that we can trust Tony Abbott. So let's hear from the former Prime Minister now.
How does it feel? Well, I always think Liberal governments do a better job than Labor governments. This has been a very unstable, incompetent government, and it's wasted our money. And on those three scores alone, it deserved to be thrown out of office. And whilst, as I said, it's not for me to declare outcomes, that is for people who have a higher station than I have, it looks pretty obvious to me that the Australian people have delivered a resounding verdict. And if Tony Abbott does emerge as Prime Minister, which I believe he will, then he will do a wonderful job. And I say to the people of Australia, you can trust Tony Abbott. He'll listen to you, he'll look after your interests, and he'll care for your money.
So that was former Prime Minister Howard there speaking pretty highly of Prime Minister-elect Tony Abbott. Earlier this week now, we're going to hear an interview I did earlier this week with La Trobe University's Vice-Chancellor John Dewar. I started by asking the Vice-Chancellor whether he agreed with the criticisms of how disappointing this campaign has been.
Well, I suppose like many other people, I've been a bit disappointed in the campaign, particularly on the Labor side, I would have to say. I've been surprised at how lacklustre the Rudd campaign has been, particularly when you compare it with the way he ran his 2007 campaign, which I thought was a brilliant campaign. I thought he came into it with some very simple, clear messages that were backed up with some very good policies, and then proceeded to run rings around John Howard. As he said at the time, you know, he played with John Howard's head for most of the election, and I don't think Howard really knew how to deal with it. So I thought that was a brilliant campaign, and you know, some very, very clear messaging. This one has been almost the complete opposite. And I realise that the Labour Party's been coming at this from a reasonably long period of incumbency, and that makes it harder to position yourself as a fresh force in politics. You've got to own a lot of the problems that have been created in the last 6 years. But I don't think Rudd has made taken full advantage of the fact that he's only recently come back to the Prime Ministership. It looked for a while as though he was going to sort of position himself as a bit of an outsider, so that he could present himself as almost not being Prime Minister. But he became too prime ministerial too quickly, I think. He seemed to enjoy the job too much, in a way. And I think that made it hard for him to stand aside from that and to almost critique his own party's legacy, which has been created in the last 6 years. So I think that's made it hard for them. On the other side, I guess we've got pretty much what we expected, which was, you know, a small target, not saying a huge amount, and just generally going on the theme of trust, which is an easy one for them to go on, given that I think a lot of the electorate has lost trust in the current government. Do
you think it's almost surprising that higher education hasn't really featured too heavily in this campaign, except for the Nationals' announcement of the National Stronger Regions Fund, which would be established under a coalition government? If the coalition is elected and that policy gets up, what sort of impact would that have on La Trobe, immediately?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it, that of all the major parties, it's the Nationals who have the most to say about higher education. You wouldn't have picked that one, although the Nationals have a very good spokesperson on regional higher education in Senator Fiona Nash, who is actually terrific and, is a deep thinker about these questions and cares deeply about regional higher education in particular. And that does have a significant implication for La Trobe. And I've spoken to Fiona a few times about what we would like to see a regional higher ed policy look like. My concern has always been that there's been too much emphasis on taking kids from the bush and sending them to the city. And as you know, at La Trobe, we actually believe in training people locally, educating people locally, because we know that that's the factor that will most likely lead them to stay local. So if you look at, for example, what our graduates in education and health sciences do when they graduate from one of our regional campuses, the vast majority, and I mean about 80%, will stay and have their lives and careers in regional Victoria. So if your objective is to add to the human capital in those communities, then I think it's really important that we avoid policies that take school leavers out of those communities and send them to the big universities in the big cities. And And I think the Nationals really understand that, and they want to see a balance, I think, between encouraging students to study locally and giving students the opportunity to study anywhere.
Well, these kind of follow on from each other pretty naturally, but what other sort of higher education policies would you like to see a new government implement?
Well, I think the Labour Party yesterday released its innovation policy, which had a bit to say about higher education. There wasn't a lot that was new in there, but there was one very interesting idea about what they call university colleges. And I do think this is something that any incoming government's going to have to look at, is whether the current landscape of provider types is the right landscape. At the moment, as you know, we've got TAFE institutes on one side, and they're state-funded, under pressure from state treasury often, particularly in Victoria. And on the other side, we've got universities. There's nothing in the middle. There's no sort of entity that is aimed specifically at broadening participation in university-level education, but which doesn't also at the same time seek to do research. And a lot of people are now saying we need to create that intermediate category if the country is going to achieve its participation targets at bachelor's level. And as you might have heard, we've entered an arrangement with the North Melbourne Institute of TAFE to create a new vehicle called the Melbourne Polytechnic, which is designed to cater to a cohort of students who would not traditionally come to university, but who are looking for bachelor's level qualifications, but in vocational areas. And we think there's a market for that sort of degree and that sort of experience that the Polytechnic model is designed to create. The Labour Party policy talks about creating what are called university colleges, but they're talking about them in particularly remote areas or peri-urban areas like the outer east of Melbourne, where participation rates are currently very low. But whoever wins, I think this is an area that will have to be looked at, because I don't think we can just go on expanding the university system with more and more students and expect that system to conduct world-class research. So I think the centre can't hold here. Something will have to change.
One of the big stories earlier this year was when the federal government announced it would cut university funding to fund the Gonski reforms, now known as Better Schools, which has bipartisan support from both sides. What sort of direct effect will that have on La Trobe and then on universities more broadly?
Well, potentially very serious effect, because the cumulative impact of this so-called efficiency dividend will be about 3.25%, a permanent 3.25% reduction in the money we receive across all Commonwealth funding programs. So that we estimate will have a significant impact on La Trobe's budget, as it will on every other university's budget over the next 4 or 5 years. That came on the top of another round of cuts that the government announced towards the end of last year, which got less attention because they focused on research funding. But again, the cumulative effect of that, when you add to the efficiency dividend, is really quite significant. So every university is going to have to find ways of cutting its cloth. Universities don't make profits. Some universities do not have large cash reserves. So we eat what we kill, really, to put it crudely. And if what comes in is leaner, then we have to operate in a leaner way, or look for new sources of revenue. But that's very competitive to do.
Would raising costs for students or anything be one of the potential new sources of revenue that universities might have to look at?
Well, at the moment, as you know, universities are very limited in their capacity to increase any kind of fee or charge to students. It's possible that an incoming coalition government might be interested in relaxing the current ceilings on student contributions under the HECS scheme, or possibly reintroducing fee-paying undergraduate places, on the assumption that the past is the best guide to the future. The coalition have expressed interest and actually implemented some of those policies in the past, for example, when Brendan Nelson was Higher Education Minister. So I suspect the best guide to what the coalition might do, and incidentally, the coalition have not, at the date of recording this interview, released any details of their higher education policy at all. But if you look for the clues as to what they might do, in what they did when they were last in government. And that was very much about fee-paying undergraduate places, giving universities more flexibility around the student contribution in the HEX scheme, and generally promoting international recruitment in higher education. So I suspect we might see something similar.
Given the sort of criticism mounted at really both major parties in terms of political leadership and that sort of thing in recent times, what role do you see universities playing as, shaping and nurturing the next, not the next generation, but future political leaders?
Vital. I think if you spoke to most politicians, they would point to their experience at university as being formative in terms of their political aspirations and giving them the networks that they subsequently drew on in their political careers. La Trobe has a proud history of producing very active, some very good politicians, and I think universities are a vital sort of seeding bed for the politicians of the future. I actually think we're a bit hard on our politicians, actually. The ones I know and talk to are highly dedicated, care passionately about their constituencies and the issues that they deal with. I think it's hard for politicians, given the constant media scrutiny they're now under, to constantly give the appearance of being on top of their game and always being super slick. But a lot of them, I think, do a great job. But it's always important to keep refreshing the pool, and universities play a really important role in that.
So that was La Trobe University Vice Chancellor John Dewar speaking to me earlier in the week. Eric, a couple of news updates on one that we're all watching. We've mentioned it a couple of times already with the seat at Indi. They're at 48% of the vote counted, and there's already a 7.9% swing away from the coalition's Sophie Mirabella. So perhaps she could be in for a bit of a tough night there. As we've been saying all along, she might have a struggle on her sleeve. Also, then we're going to go to Malcolm Turnbull in just a moment, but he spoke to Annabelle Crabb, which we will hear on about Labor's demise. He had a swing for him in his electorate, which is interesting. Isn't normally considered to be, other than Turnbull, a safe Liberal haven or anything like that.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, I actually, being an eastern suburbs boy myself, grew up in the seat of Wentworth.
How much did your school?
Oh God, don't talk to me about my school. I think that you look at what is changing in the eastern suburbs. It's gone from being a very working class area, the beaches where all the poor people live, to now it's super rich. So as someone who is a progressive, very corporate, very intelligent figure, I think he appeals to the electorate, and I can't see anybody really shaking him anytime soon.
Yeah, and just to put a number on it, 56% counted, and they're saying a 2.1% swing to Turnbull there. So, which is a pretty noticeable change. I mean, it's not setting the world on fire or anything like that, but it's still a decent swing for Turnbull.
Yeah, he'd have to be happy. I mean, he's a very curious figure now in the Liberal Party. With Tony Abbott is apparently setting himself up for a multi-term prime ministership, which really now sits Turnbull on the outer of people have been calling for him to be a prime minister candidate for some time, but he's going to have to wait for Tony to either win many elections and then stand down, or lose and then wait for Labor to lose again, because it's not looking like the Liberals would really. They surely would learn Labor's lessons and wouldn't axe one of their own unwillingly. So, some people I think will be disappointed by the sight of Turnbull as a very prominent minister, but not a prime minister for some time.
Now, you mentioned Tony Abbott. Apparently he has arrived at a function centre in Sydney, presumably to give a speech later on tonight. We still have to wait for Kevin Rudd to give his concession first, though. Before that, we're going to hear that grab from Malcolm Turnbull speaking to the ABC now.
And we're joined now by Malcolm Turnbull, coming to us from his seat of Wentworth with a further enriched margin. Congratulations, Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It's a bit of a
I was enjoying that slide you had there.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, tell me, Malcolm Turnbull, there's some very weird stuff going on in Queensland tonight. A couple of seats in New South Wales that you might have expected to win but seem to be likely to be held by the Labor Party, seats like Greenway, Parramatta, possibly even McMahon. How do you read the result at this stage?
Well, Annabelle, it's really too early for me to read it. I've been here enjoying the company of my friends and supporters in the Liberal Party here, and so we've been enjoying ourselves and celebrating the good results here in Wentworth. So I haven't been through all of the results in the way you have.
Well, let me be the first to tell you then that it looks like you've been returned to government.
Yes, no, I picked that one up, Annabelle. We're not completely cut off here in the eastern suburbs.
Can you tell us to what you attribute the defeat of Rudd Labor?
Well, I heard Stephen Smith saying earlier that disunity is death. I think that's been a big part of it. You know, if you can't govern yourselves, how can you govern the country? The depth of acrimony and animosity and hatred within the Labor Party is of an intensity that I've never seen anywhere, especially in politics before, and it was actually quite confronting. And I know you, as a journalist, have seen it close up too. So that disunity, I think, was really a key part of it. And of course, a sense that there was policy on the run, that they couldn't manage anything, that one project after another fell into disarray, the sense that after the great idea and the press release, they lost interest, there was no follow-through. And of course, I fear that in the campaign, while Kevin Rudd was obviously more popular than Julia Gillard, he started doing all the things that made him unpopular in the first place. You know, all of these, thought bubbles. Obviously, in my part of Sydney, we were quite astounded to see that Garden Island was going to be moved to Brisbane in a pretty, 3 months after a lengthy federal government examination culminating in a defence white paper, it concluded that it wasn't cost effective to do so. And, you know, it was basically, the problem was that, Kevin reincarnated was the same Kevin they'd had before. And I think that was a big part of the problem too.
Well, OK, you studied Kevin Rudd pretty intensely during the period for which you eyeballed him directly across the dispatch box. I guess you know him pretty well. What would you expect him to do now? I mean, it looks like he's been returned in his seat of Griffith. Would you expect him to bow out or plough on?
I think he'll stick around. I think he'll want to lead the Labor Party in opposition. I think he'll stick around for as long as he can.
And what's that going to mean for the ALP, you think?
Well, far be it from me to give the ALP political advice, but I think, if you're on a good thing, stick to it.
That sounds like a good rule to live by. Look, I won't keep you any longer from your lovely party.
Okay.
Malcolm Turnbull, thanks for joining us.
So that was Malcolm Turnbull speaking to Annabelle Crabb on the ABC. We're now going to go straight away to Chris Bowen, who is the Labor, well, he was a treasurer, shadow treasurer, I think is his title, speaking in McMahon. We're going to hear that now.
Thanks to the people of McMahon for their big vote of confidence today. There were plenty of people who said we couldn't win this seat. Plenty of people who said it was in the bag for the Liberal Party. Well, we showed that not to be the case. I've been the member here for 9 years. It's a great honour to represent the area I grew up in. Great honour to represent my community. And I'm very thankful to the people of McMahon for the election of me for the next 3 years, and I won't let them down. On the broader picture, obviously, it's a disappointing night to have lost office, but lost office against very difficult circumstances, having come back a long way from where we were just 2 or 3 months ago. And I think what we have are the building blocks of the next Labor government, the building blocks of a good, competitive and strong opposition, which we'll be very determined to provide.
So that was Labor's Chris Bowen speaking to Sky News. We're now going to start to dive in a little bit deeper to what this means for the Labor Party from here. We are joined by La Trobe journalism professor Laurie Zion. Laurie, anything that you will be looking for straight away in Kevin Rudd's speech to start things off?
Well, I know he's going to say I've got a zip, but I guess what I'm kind of really interested in seeing is what he indicates about his plans, because he is still the leader of the Labor Party. He's retained his seat, and assuming that the whole mechanism of changing the guard holds, and that he's able to hold on to the leadership for a while if he wants it. The really interesting thing is going to be whether he has already projected, because he would have obviously given this some thought, projected himself into a future where he's retained his seat but Labor have lost, and the leadership issue has to come up again.
So how do you think he'll distribute the blame for this loss, which is looking like a pretty bad loss? Do you think he'll, knowing Kevin, it would be unlikely for him to put his hand up and say, you know what, guys, that was on me?
I think he has to take some of it, and it would be, a lack of humility in the extreme if he doesn't, in a sense, take some of the blame for the fact that Labor have not done better than they have. What I guess, Labor is kind of stuck in a strange situation after tonight because although there has been a significant loss, it hasn't been of the scale that a lot of people predicted, including me. And so we're left in this situation where it is possible for some in the Labor Party to say, given all that's happened to the party in the last 3, 4, 5 years or whatever, but with the implication that the switch from Gillard to Rudd was a good idea, maybe maybe Rudd will in a way present a case that he's the best way forward. But I think that the Labor Party have got a huge problem on their hands if he isn't swiftly out of the way.
Do you think that by avoiding the worst case scenario result tonight, Labor's actually ended up with the worst case scenario, and that they haven't been delivered evidence of the fact that what they've been doing for the last 6 years was going down the wrong path?
Well, I think that they have to. The takeaway message from tonight, that is the mantra that everyone is repeating on all the broadcasts tonight. This disunity is death. It's pretty obvious that that's the case. I mean, it's pretty rare for governments to be booted out after 2 terms. Usually get 3 goes. And I think that the fact that Labor only just scraped in last time, it's been defeated this time, there has to be an acknowledgement within Labor that this has not really worked all that well. They can point to a whole range of other factors, but given the achievements of Labor with warding off the global financial crisis and some legislative real pluses over the period that they've been in power over the last 6 years, it's, you have to look at it from the perspective now that they're out of government, that they've done really badly. They haven't been able to sell a message. There's been an awful lot of attention to the leadership. And I just want to reiterate the point that Barry Cassidy made a couple of times, that we can't answer the question, but we still have to wonder if Julia Gillard had actually been allowed to be Prime Minister for the last 3 years without being constantly undermined by Kevin Rudd and his supporters. Could we be looking at a very different scenario for the Labor Party now? If I can plagiarise the great line from Paul Keating, in a reference he made to Andrew Peacock, a souffle doesn't rise twice. And I think we've seen that with the Rudd experiment in a way that really is disastrous for Labor tonight.
Looking past the individuals involved in this, and kind of hearkening back to what Liam and I were talking about before, do you think this does illustrate to Labor that they need to figure out who they are before they figure out who leads them?
Yeah, I think, Eric, you're right. I mean, one of the things I think that we're seeing, with, I suppose, the alienation of a lot of, you could call them the progressive elements of the party, that you're having, I think, we've seen with, as Annabelle Crabb described it, the nodders. If anyone saw Adam Bant on television before, that huge kind of band of support he's got there, where people, the reason he's got back in is he's got a very activist base. And I'm old enough to remember, Labor's wins in the 70s when I was a little kid. And what we're seeing, I think, now is that Labor doesn't really have a support base that's actively engaged in progressive agendas, that's looking at, and we can take the gay marriage issue, we can take the refugee issue, that a lot of the causes that would traditionally have been Labor to espouse, they've really hedged away from. They've gone for a particularly cynical, I think, track of trying to retain the support of Western Sydney, Southern Brisbane, and in the process, I think they've actually lost their way in retaining the enthusiasm and active engagement of a lot of their traditional support base, and that's been dispersed across the Greens. Some elements of the Labor Party still retain it, but I think that Labor's got to actually decide, well, who are they for now? Trade union membership's been declining. The unions have not been particularly enthusiastic about Labor in this election. They've been, if anything, sidelined. Rudd doesn't really engage with the unions very much. So who are they for? What do they actually stand for? And are we going to get real conviction in whoever leads the Labor Party now in defining the brand of Labor?
Would that make someone like an old school Labor guy and Bill Shorten a perhaps a logical choice too, if they were looking for a new leader in the next in the foreseeable future, that he'd be a logical choice?
Well, I think that there's an issue with Bill Shorten, and I think he's a very smart guy, but I think he's been so up to his neck in the machinations of the leadership changes. And although I think that there's something quite hackneyed about the term faceless man, because Bill Shorten is certainly not faceless, he certainly, I think, needs to, if he's going to rise above what's been going on now, be able to actually identify where he stands and be able to articulate a very different way forward for Labor than what we've seen over the last few years in the way that they engage with issues and their constituency.
Now, so we're getting a bit of word through that Kevin Rudd might be about to appear on stage on Twitter from a few people coming in. So,
So I've got to get off if Rudd gets on?
We might have to give you a boot for just a few minutes, or I'm sure we can bring you back. But we're still waiting for that to come through live. So there's some pictures of him arriving through a crowd now circulating.
Are they just selfies or are they...
No, there's actually, it appears to be someone else taking the photo of Kevin, which is a rare one for this campaign. But so we should be going to that pretty quickly. But before he does take the stage... Sorry?
Do you have a song? I mean, as someone, who's...
the Triple J Hottest 100 founder and
we can't let you off the hook without a song.
The first Triple J Hottest 100, number one was Love Will Tear Us Apart.
Sorry, we'll have to get that in a second. Cut you off there, we're going to go to the speech.
Oh, geez, I thought we'd lost. My fellow Australians, my fellow Queenslanders. And fellow members of the great Australian Labor Party. Today, we have fought the good fight as the great Australian Labor Party. Tonight is the time to unite as the great Australian nation. Because whatever our politics may be, we are all, first and foremost, Australian. And the things that unite us are more powerful than the things that divide us, which is why the world marvels at Australia, this country which can manage its political differences peacefully and conduct the most vigorous of debates peacefully and resolve our politics peacefully and with civility. That is why this country is such a great country. And that in this marvellous tapestry of modern Australia, the mosaic of our multicultural nation, that we fashion such unity out of diversity. Therein lies the great Australian miracle, which is why we are all proud to be Australian. A short time ago, I telephoned Tony Abbott to concede defeat at these national elections. As Prime Minister of Australia, I wish him well now in the high office of Prime Minister of this country. Therese and I wish he, Margie and their family well in coping with the stresses and strains of high office that lie ahead. We know a little bit of what that is like. And Therese and I look forward to greeting them at the Lodge early next week in the same gracious manner with which Mr and Mrs Howard welcomed us 6 years ago. I also wish his government well for the great and difficult challenges that now lie ahead for Australia. Now, I want to speak to Labor people and Labor supporters everywhere across Australia. Geez, a couple more days we might have got there. I know that Labor hearts are heavy across the nation tonight. And as your Prime Minister and as your parliamentary leader of the Great Australian Labor Party, I accept responsibility. I gave it my all, but it was not enough for us to win. I'm proud that despite all the prophets of doom, that we have preserved our federal parliamentary Labor Party as a viable fighting force for the future. And I'm also proud of the fact that despite the pundits, we appear to have held every seat in Queensland. I saw Sky News just before saying we're all gone, including me. Anyway, I'm proud of the fact that we've held each of our seats in Queensland. I'm proud of the fact that every Cabinet Minister has been returned at this election. And I'm proud that practically all other members of our executive have been returned as well. But tonight, we have lost many fine Labor men and women from our parliament. And I would like to thank them personally for their courage and their unswerving commitment to our cause, to our party and to our nation. Just as I'd like to thank each and every one of you, the true believers of Australia, who have worked so hard this campaign for your unswerving commitment and to our cause and to our nation. For our party and for our movement, we have known defeat before. But I say this to you, throughout our 122-year history, we have always risen from defeat. To renew our party with fresh vigour and with new ideas for the future. And we'll do it again. Ben Chifley's light on the hill still burns bright across Australia. It is a flame that cannot be extinguished. And while there's still breath in Labor bodies, strength in Labor sinews and hope in Labor hearts, Ben Chifley's light on the hill will continue forever. So in the time of rebuilding that lies ahead, we must never lose sight of that clear and guiding light, for it remains the beacon of progressive politics for us all. It is what others have called the audacity of hope, or put more simply, our simple, audacious belief that we can make our community and our country and world a better place for all, not just for some, for all, not just for some. And a progressive view of politics that says that we can believe that we can make this community and nation and world of ours a better place than the one we inherited from our forebears. That's the progressive vision of the future. Once again, tonight, I thank the good burghers of Griffith for their support. It would be un-prime ministerial of me to say, Bill Glasson, eat your heart out, so I won't. The good people of Griffith, the good people of Brisbane's South Side, it is such a fantastic community, and I thank them for their support. It is a truly marvellous part of Australia, and I thank them for again returning me as their local member. For the rest of my parliamentary and ministerial team, let me say a few words. I'd like to thank now directly our Deputy Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Elbow for a Rabbitohs supporter. You got a lot of support up here in Broncos land. I thank you, Elbow, for your courage, your loyalty, your remarkable humour, and your determination always to fight, fight and fight. I'd also like tonight to thank our Senate leader, Penny Wong, for her strength. Well, rarely, Penny, do South Australians get that welcome up here. So. Mind you, I'm married to one. I thank you, Penny, for your strength, your common sense and your friendship, just as I thank your Deputy, Jacinta Collins, for hers. To the Cabinet, the Ministers and the Parliamentary Secretaries, I value your energy, your fighting spirit and your dedication, and that of all your staff who have been out there supporting us all the way through. To our branch members, our campaign workers and our volunteers, I thank you, the army of true believers. I thank too our affiliated unions across the nation for your solidarity with Labor's cause and for your formidable work in the field. You too are the heart and soul of our Labor movement. You too are part of the army of true believers. To my Prime Ministerial staff, what a fantastic team. Bruce Hawker is here somewhere, a person who has worked on 40 Labor campaigns over the years, is a campaign veteran. Give him a round of applause. Patrick Gorman, who has been with me. And for a sand groper from West Australia, has settled into Queensland remarkably well. Patrick, you've been with me for so long. I thank you for your loyalty, your sense of humour. Jessica Bukowski for managing my world. She's a Queenslander, by the way. Fiona Sugden, my press secretary, who came back from her previous work with me as Prime Minister to join this cause of the last couple of months. Fiona, we love you. 3 kids under 3 or 4. How does she do it with a baby of 6 or 7 months? Wonder Woman, that's what I say. And also, of course, Corrie McKenzie, who is here as my Deputy Chief of Staff. Jim Murphy, my Chief of Staff. The rest of my media team, Matthew Franklin, Eamon Fitzpatrick and Maggie Lloyd, all the other fantastic members of my staff, I love you all. And for putting up with me. I really do thank you for that. Finally, I'd like to thank also our National Secretary, George Wright, and his incredible staff of 150 workers at campaign headquarters down there in Melbourne for all the work you have done. Thank you, team. My wonderful electoral staff led by Katrina Hicks. Put your hand up, Katrina. And the whole electoral team, including my longest-serving staff member, Fleur Foster, out there in force today, you are a team of champions. Malcolm McMillan, the President of our FEC, Les Henning, its Treasurer, all of our branch members in the Griffith FEC, you are marvels. And finally, to each and every member of my family here. They are my life, my hope, my encouragement, my support, and without them, I could have done none of this. With them, it has been possible. To Therese and Marcus, to Nicholas and Zara, I love you all. Jessica and Albert were with us until only half an hour ago. Our bub, our granddaughter Josie, has come down with a fever. They're now off at the local hospital. That's life on the campaign. She would be here in spirit as 14 months old, the youngest young Labor member ever. Friends, you've had a hard day. So let's bring this to a close when I say that throughout our history, we, the Labor Party, have been a party of hard heads and soft hearts. That is the genius of Labor, always attending to the tough questions of the economy and national security, through war and through peace, through depression and recession, but never allowing our hearts to harden to those of our Australian family who are the most vulnerable. It is this combination which is the unique legacy of Labor. This is a great movement, and I salute the movement for its strength, its vitality and its future. I have been honoured to serve as your Prime Minister and as your party's leader. But there comes a time when you know you've given it your all, and a time for the party to further renew its leadership for the future. For me, that time is now. So I will not be recontesting the leadership of the Parliamentary Labor Party. The Australian people, I believe, deserve a fresh start with our leadership. I know this will not be welcome news to some of you, but my responsibility has been to maintain Labor as a fighting force for the future so that we can unite behind the next leader of our party. I have taken this decision with a heavy heart because I love this party, I love the movement, I love the values for which we stand. I love the vision we have for Australia's future. And I love the hard work of translating that into policies that make our future. Disability care, Medicare, Denticare, the future, better schools, better hospitals. That's us. We do those things. But the time has come for renewal. We've begun the process of party reform, including the process new formed for the election of the leader, so that in the future our leaders will be elected by a combination of 50% of you, the entire branch membership of our party, and 50% from the parliamentary members. This is the beginning of the democratisation of our party. And I say